Morning, in the pre-scientific world, was less a peaceful moment of yawning and stretching and more a spiritual audit. Before you even opened your eyes, fate, luck, spirits, and every ancestor you had were apparently gathered around your bed, clipboards ready, waiting to see whether you would choose fortune or disaster with your very first move. Today, we treat mornings as battles against alarm clocks and questionable coffee. Back then, mornings were battles against invisible forces that were convinced you were on their payroll. And the worst part, you didn't even remember signing the contract. Before we step into a world where everyday life was ruled by signs and omens, take a moment to like and subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day superstition might feel closest to you right now. Now let's begin. The belief that the first action of the day could decide everything from health to marriage prospects to whether your crops would turn into actual food instead of mysterious disappointment was surprisingly universal. In many cultures, your first step out of bed determined the tone of your entire day. Step out with your right foot and congratulations, prosperity, protection, and a day with fewer disasters than usual. Step out with your left foot and you might as well have crawled back under the blanket and waited for the world to reboot. Being left-footed wasn't merely a personal quirk, it was practically a lifestyle hazard. This obsession with morning behaviour came from the idea that early hours were liminal time, neither night nor day, a perfect window for the supernatural to poke you, prod you, or judge your housekeeping. Morning wasn't peaceful, it was spiritually crowded. The moment you sat up, you weren't alone. You had an audience, and not the supportive kind that claps politely. You had the kind that watches, whispers, and holds grudges. Even sitting up had rules. You couldn't just roll out of bed like a sack of potatoes. No, you had to sit up carefully in the correct direction because certain directions were believed to invite blessings, while others invited misfortune, illness, or the neighbour's chickens refusing to lay eggs again. People genuinely feared yawning toward the wrong corner of the room because that was considered essentially waving an invitation to malevolent spirits, saying, "The door is open, please ruin my week." Before leaving the bed entirely, many households insisted on small rituals. Some touched the ground before standing to thank the earth, while others avoided touching it at all until they'd completed a whispered charm. In some places, you had to recite a rhyme so the sun wouldn't think you were ungrateful. Imagine waking up, groggy, hair pointing in 17 directions, and immediately worrying about offending a giant ball of gas you've never even met personally. Mornings weren't gentle, they were diplomatic negotiations, and let's not forget the superstitions about what you saw first. Your entire day's luck could depend on whether the first person you encountered had a pleasant face, an unpleasant personality, or a suspicious number of eyebrows. Seeing someone unlucky first thing could ruin everything. You might spend the rest of the day avoiding them as if they were carrying a contagious cloud of failure. In some towns, people even avoided looking in mirrors first thing, not because of vanity, but because they believed their sleepy, half-conscious reflection might be weaker and unable to resist spiritual interference. In other words, you at 6 a.m. was not powerful enough to handle reality. Even the temperature of the room mattered. A chill was a sign the spirits were nearby. A warm room meant fortune had already visited. A room that smelled strange? Well, that one was just medieval sanitation, but they confidently blamed demons anyway. Because nothing says I understand the world like blaming invisible forces for the fact you sleep next to a bucket that was also your toilet. Breakfast itself wasn't free of superstition either. Though true to our rules, the specifics will come in later chapters. For now, imagine walking toward the morning meal with the knowledge that everything from where you stepped, to which eye twitched first, to whether the dog sneezed in your direction was potentially a sign from the universe. Who needs caffeine when terror will wake you just fine? Why did all of this matter so much? Because morning symbolized vulnerability. When you woke up, you were returning from the unknown, from the dream world, from the death-adjacent state everyone worried a little too much about. People genuinely believed you were not fully you until you performed enough actions to anchor your soul back into your body. Basically, morning was a daily software reboot, and the system was notoriously buggy. These rules gave people structure in a world where disease, famine, and random misfortune were always lurking around the corner. If everything was unpredictable, then controlling even the smallest part of the day, your first step, your first glance, your first breath, gave a sense of power. It turned chaos into something you could negotiate with. Superstition wasn't silly to them. It was survival with extra steps. So when you woke up in the past, you weren't simply beginning a new day. You were entering a cosmic courtroom where fate wore spectacles and took notes. The good news, if you did everything correctly, you might earn a peaceful day. The bad news, you had absolutely no idea what correctly meant, and the rules changed depending on who you asked. And that is why waking up wasn't refreshing. It was a test you didn't study for. In the past, a mirror was never just a mirror. Today it's a tool for fixing hair, adjusting outfits, and wondering how you can look exhausted before the day even begins. But historically, mirrors were surveillance devices, except you weren't the one doing the watching, the mirror was watching you. Staring into a polished surface wasn't about admiring yourself. It was about making sure the universe hadn't stolen anything important, like your soul, your future, or your fate. A mirror wasn't harmless. It was dangerous decor. The earliest mirrors, polished obsidian, bronze, copper, already had an unsettling aura. They were dark, imperfect, and reflective enough to show your general existence, but not enough to hide your mistakes. Looking into one felt less like checking your appearance and more like confronting the possibility that something looking back was not entirely friendly. And so the belief began. Reflections were more than visuals. They were spiritual doubles. If the world had a physical version of you and a reflected version, then damaging one could damage the other. Your mirror self wasn't just a reversed you, it was your soul's stunt double. Anything that happened to it, theoretically happened to you. That's why breaking a mirror was catastrophic. Not, oops, I'll sweep it up catastrophic, but, well, that's 7 years off my life expectancy. People believed that fracturing your reflection meant fracturing your luck, your spirit, or your destiny. 7 years wasn't chosen randomly. It matched ancient ideas that the soul renewed itself in cycles. So according to superstition, breaking a mirror didn't just ruin your interior decorating. It cracked your soul mid-update. The spiritual equivalent of unplugging your computer during a system reboot. To avoid cosmic penalties, people invented rituals. You couldn't just throw broken mirror shards away. You had to bury them, burn them, toss them into running water, or whisper apologies at them. Yes, apologizing to glass was once normal behavior, and if you failed to complete the ritual correctly, well, you could expect misfortune to follow you like an overly dramatic cloud hissing, "You did this to yourself." Mirrors were also believed to reveal spirits, not in a fun theatrical ghost shows up and delivers a monologue way, more like a subtle, uncomfortable sense that you weren't the only one gazing into the reflective world. People feared looking into mirrors at night because the darkness supposedly weakened the barrier between the physical body and the mirrored soul. If something happened to your reflection in the dark, you might not get it back in the morning. The safest nighttime policy? Don't look in the mirror. Don't walk near the mirror. Honestly, maybe just cover the mirror and pretend you don't own one. And people absolutely did cover them. When someone died in the house, every mirror was draped immediately. This wasn't interior design, it was spiritual hazard control. The logic was simple. If the soul of the dead person wandered by and saw a reflection, it might get sucked into the glass and stay trapped, unable to move on. No one wanted grandma's spirit living in the hallway mirror for eternity, watching you brush your teeth with supernatural disappointment. Worse still, an uncovered mirror might steal the soul of the living while they were vulnerable in grief. You weren't just mourning, you were dodging spiritual collateral damage. Some believed mirrors predicted death by refusing to reflect a person marked by fate. If someone looked into a mirror and appeared pale, distorted, or partially missing, people took it as a sign the person would die soon. Sometimes the mirror was just dirty or warped, but superstition doesn't care about physics, it cares about drama. Mirrors also played a role in courtship rituals, with questionable safety standards. Young women would stare into a mirror at midnight by candlelight, hoping to glimpse their future husband's face. The rules were strict. The room must be the candle must be steady. And the mirror must be large enough for destiny to appear, but not so large that something else might join the party. Because if it wasn't the face of your future husband showing up, superstition suggested you might see the Grim Reaper instead. Truly the definition of mixed results. The belief that mirrors were spirit gateways made them both feared and revered. People thought reflective surfaces could open portals for witches, demons, or wandering forces looking for new real estate. Households sometimes placed mirrors facing outward near doors to bounce evil spirits away, essentially spiritual bug zappers. Other times they faced mirrors inward to trap the bad luck inside. The rules were never consistent. Mirrors followed vibes, not logic. Despite all this terror, people still needed mirrors for grooming. The compromise? Use them sparingly. Look quickly. Don't use them at night. Don't leave them uncovered near the sick. Don't let children stare into them for too long. Consider travelling with a mirror charm or saying a short blessing before approaching one. Mirrors weren't here to help you. They were here to test your risk tolerance. In the end, mirrors represented humanity's fear of the unknown and the uncanny. A reflection is familiar yet reversed, real yet not real, an unsettling contradiction before psychology had a name for such things. People didn't fear their looks. They feared the possibility that the reflection looking back might not fully belong to them. So no, people didn't check mirrors for vanity. They checked to make sure their fix and their fate were still firmly attached. Before modern people used whistling to get a dog's attention, annoy a sibling, or pretend they know the tune of a song they absolutely do not know, whistling had a very different purpose. It frightened everyone within earshot. The sound wasn't charming, it was a spiritual siren, the equivalent of tapping a microphone and asking, "Hey, any wandering forces want to ruin my day?" You weren't making music, you were making invitations, and nothing travelled faster than a whistle, except perhaps the panic that followed it. Whistling was feared across countless cultures, and for good reason. People believed it attracted the wrong audience. Spirits, demons, mischievous forces, nature gods, the weather itself. If it could hear, it could take offence. The idea was simple. Wind belonged to the supernatural, and whistling mimicked wind. By making that sound yourself, you were trespassing on someone else's territory. Imagine whistling in the middle of town and having half the street glare at you because they thought you had just insulted an invisible storm god. You would stop immediately, not out of politeness, but out of self-preservation. One of the most widespread fears was that whistling summoned storms. Sailors especially took this seriously. If you whistled on a ship, you weren't announcing boredom, you were summoning wind, waves, or, if you were really unlucky, a full-blown tempest. Captains didn't merely dislike whistling, they banned it. A sailor caught whistling could expect yelling, punishment, or, depending on the superstition level, being forced to apologise to the sea. And the sea did not accept apologies easily. The reasoning made sense to people of the time. The wind was unpredictable, uncontrollable, and deeply connected to fate. Ships relied on it but also feared it. Whistling was seen as an attempt to force the wind to act, and the spirits who controlled it were believed to respond with the enthusiastic spite of a cat being told to get off the saddle. Even today, some maritime traditions maintain the superstition. If you whistle on a boat, someone may still tap you on the shoulder and whisper, "Unless you can calm the ocean, please stop." But storms weren't the only things whistling could summon. Many communities believed whistling called spirits, especially at night. If someone whistled after sunset, neighbours would slowly peek out their doors to check whether the sound came from a living person or something less alive and far more curious. Spirits, it was said, followed sounds more than sights, and a whistle was like sending out a spiritual GPS signal. Here I am, ready for haunting. You may imagine nighttime in the past as dark, quiet and peaceful. In reality, it was dark, quiet and full of people desperately trying not to whistle, because silence was the only barrier between them and supernatural visitation. Children were told horrifying bedtime stories about whistling, attracting entities that lurked in forests, rooftops, or lonely roads. Parents didn't need to repeat the warning. Once was enough. You didn't test the theory because if you were wrong, the consequences weren't just grounding, they were existential. In some regions, whistling indoors was even considered an invitation for misfortune to walk into the home. Not just spirits, but bad luck itself. A careless tune could mean money troubles, illness, or the cow refusing to give milk again. Housewives would glare so intensely at indoor whistlers that even demons would have backed away. The logic here was that the home was a fragile sanctuary. Sound could break its protection, and so unnecessary noise, especially noise that resembled the wind, was forbidden. Maintaining silence was less about peace and more about preventing cosmic vandalism. Then came the belief that whistling summoned thieves. A whistled melody was thought to be a signal, either intentionally or unintentionally, to criminals lurking nearby. In some towns, whistling at night was practically an invitation for burglary, a superstition that was, frankly, plausible that people didn't question it. If someone whistled outside your home after midnight, you didn't assume they were practicing for a music competition. You assumed they were casing the place, and because of this, laws were made against nighttime whistling. Imagine being fined not for noise pollution, but for accidental encouragement of crime. In the world of witches and magic, whistling had an entirely different layer of danger. Some believed witches communicated through coded whistles. Others believed that whistling could accidentally perform part of a spell, like casting a charm with terrible pronunciation and getting the magical equivalent of a scam email. Even the wind itself was thought to carry messages, so adding your own whistle to the mix was like sending an unsolicited voicemail to supernatural entities who did not appreciate communication attempts. The fear extended to nature. Whistling in forests or mountains was strictly avoided, as it was believed to disturb spirits of the land. Echoes were especially terrifying. People didn't think echoes were bouncing sound waves. They believed something was imitating you, something with intent, something with teeth you didn't want to see. All these beliefs created a simple rule. If you were alive and wanted to stay that way, don't whistle. Not on land, not at sea, not at night, not indoors, not near animals, not near forests, not during storms, not while working. In summary, not ever. And so silence wasn't courtesy, it was self-defense. The less noise you made, the fewer supernatural forces you accidentally summoned. Whistling wasn't entertainment, it was a risk assessment. And the risk was never worth the tune. So yes, whistling invited disaster. That cheerful sound wasn't cheer at all, it was a cosmic, "Here I am," sent to the wrong audience. In the past, the left side wasn't just a direction. It wasn't just a hand preference. It wasn't just the side you accidentally tripped toward when you weren't fully awake. No, the left side was a moral failing, a spiritual liability, and, for many unfortunate people, a lifelong public relations disaster. In a world where everything symbolic carried enormous weight, being left-handed didn't mean you were unique. It meant you were possibly in league with forces that rural communities preferred not to name aloud. The left side wasn't an inconvenience, it was a warning label. Humanity has always loved dividing things into neat categories: good and bad, light and dark, divine and dangerous. And for reasons that made perfect sense before science arrived and still make no sense afterward, the right side was declared the honourable, pure, respectable direction. The left side, that was reserved for trouble. Linguistically, culturally, spiritually, the left side lost every competition. In Latin, sinistra meant left, but it eventually evolved into the English word sinister, which should tell you exactly how much sympathy left-handed people could expect. Medieval scholars didn't stop there. They wrote treatises explaining that the right hand was the hand of blessing, the hand of God, the hand of virtue. The left hand? That was the hand of impulsiveness, witchcraft, and questionable life choices. Suddenly, a child picking up a spoon with their left hand wasn't adorable. It was alarming. Parents in earlier centuries spent countless hours correcting left-handed tendencies. Not gently either. If a child reached for something with their left hand, the parent would swat it away as though the limb itself were possessed. Schools got involved. teachers forced left-handed children to write with their right hands, believing they were saving the children's souls, or at least saving the community from having to deal with a future adult who might accidentally curse someone just by stirring a pot counterclockwise. And yes, even stirring direction mattered. Stir clockwise and your soup was fine. Stir counterclockwise leftward and people would eye you as though your broth now contained demons, bad harvests, or at the very least terrible weather. A simple kitchen routine carried the weight of spiritual suspicion. If you were left-handed and cooked, you lived one tiny mistake away from being blamed for someone's disappointing stew. Even movement had rules. Entering a doorway left foot first could attract bad luck. Turning left at a crossroads was believed to lead you toward misfortune, or into the territory of wandering spirits who preferred that direction. Entire paths were avoided because they naturally curved left. Travellers didn't want to test whether the stories were true. Roads were already dangerous. Why make them supernatural as well? And as you might imagine, the church had something to say about all of this. In medieval Christian iconography, the saved were often placed on Christ's right side, while the damned were placed on the left. This was not a metaphor people took lightly. When religious images show the left side as eternal doom, you can bet communities began watching which hand you used to lift your mug. Choosing the left wasn't just a preference, it was a statement. The association deepened when illnesses, deformities or misfortune were blamed on leftward influences. If a cow stopped producing milk or a storm destroyed the crops, some unlucky left-handed person in town might catch suspicious glances as though their biology had personally offended the weather. People who naturally gravitated toward the left side of a room, walked left around a fire, or gestured with their left hand during an argument were said to invite negativity. In short, leftness became a personality trait, a moral flaw, and a spiritual hazard. Even animals weren't safe from the superstition. A horse that stepped left first was considered unlucky. A dog that circled counterclockwise too often was watched closely, because apparently even household pets were expected to follow the cultural expectation of right equals good. If your chickens wandered to the left side of the yard too frequently, people wondered if your land was cursed. Nobody wondered why the chickens went there. They wondered what the chickens knew. Some communities developed elaborate rituals to counteract leftward influence. If a person accidentally performed an action with their left hand, lighting a candle, shaking a hand, handing over money, they were expected to quickly repeat the action with their right hand to correct the mistake. Failing to do so meant risking a chain reaction of bad luck, or because your dominant hand wasn't fashionable. Strangely, despite the overwhelming suspicion around leftness, people still needed the left hand for practical reasons. You couldn't ban it entirely. Biology had opinions, so culture solved this by assigning the left hand all the unpleasant tasks. Anything considered impure, risky, or morally questionable fell to the left side. The right hand received blessings, greetings, and honour. The left hand did the rest. If something needed cleaning, holding, scraping, or discarding, congratulations, that was the left hand's job now. The social cost of all this was immense. Left-handed individuals grew up adapting, hiding their natural instincts, and learning how to move through a world that believed their body orientation reflected their spiritual orientation. That's a lot of pressure for a hand, but beneath this superstition lay a deeper truth. People feared anything unpredictable. The left hand was statistically less common and therefore less understood, and in a world where the unknown carried more weight than the known, rarity was suspicious by default. So if you were born left-handed in the past, your life was one long exercise in convincing everyone you weren't secretly plotting something. Your movements were monitored, your gestures were interpreted, your stir direction was judged. Being left-handed wasn't a crime, but it was definitely considered evidence. Because in a society obsessed with symbolism, the left side wasn't merely inconvenient. It was a problem, one that followed you everywhere, literally at her hand. Food has always been a necessity, but in the past it doubled as a prophetic medium, an edible crystal ball except significantly more dangerous and much more likely to catch fire. Kitchens weren't just places to cook, They were battlegrounds where every ingredient, movement, and mishap was loaded with meaning. And nothing carried heavier symbolism than salt. Spilling it wasn't an oops moment. It was a supernatural incident report, a warning, a flashing neon sign saying someone at this table is about to have a very bad week. Salt was precious, so precious that in some eras its value rivaled currency. Not because it tasted good, though it certainly made medieval stew more bearable, but because it preserved food, prevented rot, and symbolized purity and protection. Salt kept death at bay, both literally and spiritually, so naturally, when it spilled, people assumed death took it personally and circled your name on its to-do list. The superstition was simple but brutal. Spilled salt meant misfortune, often death. Would strike the household, or worse, betrayals from someone close. It wasn't the kind of superstition you could laugh off. You couldn't just shrug and say, "My bad." You were expected to react immediately, as if someone had just dropped a lit torch on a hay roof. The remedy? Throw a pinch of the spilled salt over your left shoulder, right into the face of the devil supposedly lurking there. Because of course the devil would just casually stand behind you at a dinner hoping you'd make a seasoning error. This ritual wasn't optional. If you forgot, people around you would remind you with the urgency of someone yelling, "Fire!" Whether or not demons had a personal vendetta against your mealtime technique didn't matter. You weren't going to risk it. Imagine being ready to eat after a long day of labour only to knock over the salt and immediately be forced into exorcism light. Dinner didn't start until you had properly assaulted an unseen entity behind your shoulder. Salt was far from the only food-based omen that could destroy a peaceful evening. Nearly every kitchen mishap carried symbolism. Drop a piece of bread, someone would fall ill. Burn the meal, bad luck for days, knock over a spoon, a stranger was coming, break a plate. A fight was imminent. If the family dog refused the leftovers, people suspected the meal, or possibly a dinner guest, was cursed. Basically, if something went wrong in the kitchen, superstition decided it wasn't your cooking skills. It was a spiritual warning system. Salt, however, stood above all. Its power was legendary. In many regions, salt lines were drawn across thresholds to keep evil out. Babies were given a pinch of salt to protect them from wandering spirits. Salt was placed in coffins to guide souls safely. It seasoned food, guarded homes, purified the dead, and prevented decay. So spilling it threatened the fragile barrier between order and chaos. People believed malevolent forces leaped at the opportunity to exploit such a symbolic failure. The fear was so intense that salt was treated like a supernatural smoke alarm. A spilled pinch triggered immediate concern, a spilled handful could spark genuine panic. Cooks were blamed for tempting fate. Dinner guests shifted nervously, wondering if they should leave before the curse kicked in. Entire families quietly braced for catastrophe, all because someone's elbow brushed a tiny bowl of seasoning. And the paranoia didn't end there. Superstitions claimed whoever spilled the salt would be the one afflicted. If you were clumsy at dinner, suddenly everyone watched you with the expression of someone wondering if you had updated your will. You might spend the rest of the night performing extra rituals, touching wood, making signs of protection, or muttering prayers, just to convince yourself you weren't doomed by bad table etiquette. Salt wasn't only associated with misfortune, it was tied to betrayal. The idea likely emerged from the symbolic role salt played in sealing agreements and friendships. Sharing salt meant sharing loyalty, so spilling it suggested that trust, somewhere somehow, was about to break. Leonardo da Vinci even depicted Judas Iscariot knocking over a container of salt in the Last Supper, cementing salt's reputation as the foreshadowing tool of traitors. If someone spilled salt near you, you might start reconsidering your entire relationship with them. Did they intend it? Was it a sign? Should you watch your back at breakfast tomorrow? With all these dangers, dinner became an exercise in emotional endurance. Every gesture carried meaning. A dropped knife meant aggression. A fork pointing the wrong direction predicted arguments. Even the placement of bowls had rules. Households developed elaborate habits to avoid accidental omens, placing salt away from elbows, using covered containers, and making sure the table was perfectly steady. Meals were eaten not just carefully but strategically. You weren't only feeding yourself, you were navigating the mystical minefield of dinner. Of course, not everyone believed in these superstitions, but nobody wanted to be the one who tested them. If your neighbour's house burned down or your cousin fell mysteriously ill after you spilled salt, congratulations. You were now the star of a superstition-based blame game. Better to throw salt over your shoulder and move on. Spiritual maintenance was easier than explaining coincidence. The deeper truth behind all of this was fear. Fear of randomness, fear of illness, fear of losing control. Food was survival, and anything that threatened it, spoiling, rotting, contamination, became wrapped in ritual. Salt, the great protector, carried the weight of safety. Spilling it meant safety had slipped, and people grasped for meaning in the chaos. So yes, dinner in the past nourished your body, but more importantly, it tested your luck, your relationships, and your ability not to knock things over. Because in a world of food omens, the meal didn't simply feed you, it dared you to get through it without inviting catastrophe. In the past, a sneeze was not the harmless burst of chaos we know today, a sudden explosion of air, noise, and facial contortion that makes you briefly question your structural integrity. No, back then a sneeze was a full-scale spiritual emergency. It was the bodily equivalent of your soul leaning a little too far out the window and almost falling out. People didn't say bless you to be polite. They said it because they genuinely feared that if they didn't act fast enough, something invisible would sprint into your head and borrow your body like a poorly supervised rental. The belief that sneezing endangered the soul was remarkably widespread. Many cultures feared that during a sneeze, the body's protective barriers opened, momentarily weakening the boundary between the physical and the spiritual. That tiny second of vulnerability was enough for mischief, illness, curses, or worse. To people in the past, a sneeze wasn't just a sneeze, it was an escape hatch. Something in you might be leaving, or something outside might be preparing to enter. And when neither option is good, everyone starts paying attention. One of the oldest fears was that a sneeze expelled part of the soul itself. If enough pieces escaped, the logic went, you'd run out. Souls weren't thought of as renewable resources. You couldn't just wait for them to grow back. So people developed verbal shields. A quick blessing acted as a spiritual net, catching the soul before it could drift too far. Some blessings were short and urgent. Others were long enough to be full speeches, depending on how seriously a community took its soul retention policies. Children considered especially vulnerable were watched closely. If a child sneezed too many times in a row, caregivers whispered protective charms or rushed to cover the child's face with fabric hands or, in extreme cases, entire blankets. Imagine being a medieval toddler. You sneeze once and suddenly 5 adults descend upon you like you've activated a self-destruct sequence. Sneezing was also connected to death omens. In some regions, a sudden sneeze inside a quiet room meant someone nearby was about to die, or had already died, and their passing sent a ripple through the living world. If the sneeze happened while someone was telling a story, people believed it confirmed the truth of what was spoken. If it happened during silence, it confirmed the fear that silence had been broken for a reason. Sneezes, quite unfairly, became the accidental narrators of fate, but the fear didn't stop at souls and death. Sneezing was also tied to possession. The logic: when you sneeze, your body suddenly jerks, convulses, and makes a noise you didn't consciously choose, essentially acting without permission. To people with no understanding of allergies, dust, or viral infections, the explanation was obvious. Something spiritual was shaking you. A good sneeze could be interpreted as a demon attempting entry. A violent one might mean the demon succeeded, and a sneeze that came with a shiver, that was practically a cosmic handshake. In many regions, people developed elaborate responses depending on the type of sneeze. A single sneeze meant mischief was nearby. 2 sneezes meant someone was gossiping about you. 3 sneezes meant illness was coming. 4 or more sneezes meant you had offended something powerful, or winter was about to be especially unkind. Households didn't wait to find out which was true. They went straight into defensive rituals. Someone would draw protective symbols, sprinkle herbs, light incense, recite charms, or, if panic was high enough, begin planning a small cleansing ceremony. The timing of sneezing mattered too. Sneeze in the morning? Bad luck all day. Sneeze while eating? A sign the meal was carrying spiritual contamination or that someone at the table was lying. Sneeze while speaking? A warning to stop talking before you said something you'd regret. Superstition that frankly might still be useful today. Sneeze at midnight? Absolutely catastrophic. You might spend the rest of the night awake, praying that whatever answered the sneeze didn't actually find your location. Even the direction mattered. A sneeze facing north was considered ominous, facing east was lucky, facing west meant money troubles, facing south meant someone you knew would visit soon. People interpreted sneezes with a level of seriousness usually reserved today for meteorologists predicting hurricanes. The sneeze wasn't just a reaction, it was a forecast. Animals sneezing also carried meaning. A dog sneezing could signal good luck. A cat sneezing could mean wealth, or a plague outbreak depending on the region's mood. Livestock sneezing at the wrong moment was taken as a sign of incoming illness or natural disaster. When your farm animals had the audacity to sneeze near you, entire plans for the week could be rearranged. And of course, there were always the people who tried to sneeze quietly to avoid attention. But suppressing a sneeze had its own dangers. Some believed it could trap evil inside the body. Others thought it stopped the soul from returning properly. In short, there was no winning. Sneezing loudly invited spirits. Sneezing quietly offended fate. Blessings, therefore, were essential. They weren't mere courtesies. They were emergency spiritual first aid. The speed and tone of the blessing mattered. Too slow and people assumed the soul might already be halfway down the street. Too casual, and they worried you weren't taking the situation seriously. Too enthusiastic, and you looked suspicious, as if you secretly hoped something was trying to claim the sneezer. Ultimately, sneezing was a reminder of how fragile people believed their connection to the world was. If a single involuntary burst of air could endanger life, soul, or sanity, then everything needed rituals and protection. A sneeze wasn't just a bodily function, it was a cosmic event, a miniature crisis requiring collective response. So when someone sneezed, people didn't just say, "Bless you." They said with genuine urgency, "Please don't die. Please don't get possessed. Please don't lose your soul. Please don't invite demons." Blessing someone wasn't politeness. It was damage control. In the past, shoes were not just shoes. They were not fashion, not protection, not something you toss in a corner and forget exists until morning. No, shoes were spiritual landmines. They were small leather warnings that fate was always watching, and fate had very strong opinions about where footwear should and should not be placed. If you dared put them in the wrong spot, you didn't just break etiquette. You practically filed an invitation with the underworld. To begin with, shoes on the table were one of the most universally feared omens of bad luck, illness, or death. Today, putting shoes on the table signals that you have no regard for hygiene. Historically, it signaled you had no regard for survival. Shoes were intimately connected to the road, to wandering spirits, to dirt that carried illness, and to symbolic travel. And what is death, if not the final journey? So the logic went, placing shoes on the dining table, where your family ate and gathered, symbolically invited death to join the meal. Not exactly the dinner guest anyone wanted. Even worse, in some cultures, shoes on the table were directly tied to funeral practices. After someone died, their clothing, including their shoes, was sometimes laid out before burial. Putting shoes on a table therefore mimicked death customs, which horrified people. You weren't being messy, you were reenacting mortality. If someone accidentally put shoes on a table, the corrective rituals were immediate and dramatic. People would snatch the shoes away, mutter protective charms, or slam their palms on wood to break the omen. Your clumsiness wasn't just inconvenient, it traumatized everyone present. Beds were no safer. Shoes on a bed were a surefire omen of sickness or tragedy. Beds were sacred spaces, associated with birth, dreams, recovery and death. Shoes, meanwhile, carried dust from roads where all manner of misfortune travelled. Putting a shoe on a bed symbolically placed the chaos of the outside world onto the most vulnerable place in the home. And since many people died in their beds, the mere image of shoes touching that space blurred the line between life and death. It didn't matter if you were just packing for a trip. Put your boots on the mattress and someone would gasp like you had summoned a curse. The fear of shoes didn't stop at furniture. Thresholds were another danger zone. The doorway was one of the most spiritually charged spots in a home, a boundary between safety and unpredictability. Shoes left on a threshold were believed to block luck, trap spirits, or confuse the protective forces guarding the house. In some places, stepping over shoes placed in a doorway was considered asking for misfortune. You weren't just navigating clutter, you were performing an accidental ritual of doom. Threshold superstitions grew from the idea that the doorway was a zone of transition. Anything placed there needed to be intentional. Shoes represented movement, departure, and the unknown. Leaving them on the cusp of the house hinted symbolically at someone soon to depart permanently. This was not the kind of foreshadowing anyone wanted. People therefore kept shoes well away from doorways, lined against walls, tucked under benches, placed in corners, but never, ever where fate might misinterpret them. Then there were the beliefs surrounding new shoes. New shoes on the table were especially dangerous, as if the shoes were fresh recruits eager to perform their first symbolic execution. Some regions believed this omen predicted a family member dying within the year. Others claimed it foretold financial ruin, and occasionally someone would announce the mildest version of the superstition. New shoes on the table meant a terrible argument was coming. Not that this was comforting, nobody wanted to fight because of footwear. Old shoes carried their own lore. Some people kept an old shoe by the fireplace to bring luck. Others placed children's shoes in walls for protection. But even these enchanted footwear items had their limits. They were never to be placed in forbidden areas, or their protective magic reversed into threats. Shoes were like spiritual batteries. If you put them in the wrong spot, they short-circuited fate. Guests also watched shoe placement closely. A visitor kicking off their shoes too close to a hearth, table or bed could send the entire household into panic. Hosting someone became an exercise in subtle shoe management. "Please take your shoes off," wasn't politeness. It was a desperate plea to avoid unintentional omens. And if the guest ignored the hint and tossed their shoes casually onto a chair, people would exchange looks, meaning, well, if catastrophe strikes, we know who caused it. Footwear even influenced travel symbolism. If shoes were left upside down, it meant travel gone wrong or a journey cut short. This was taken seriously in communities reliant on travel for trade or migration. A shoe turned the wrong way wasn't just messy, it was a prophecy. All these taboos came from a deeper fear. Movement equals danger. Shoes were objects that carried you into the unknown. They walked roads full of thieves, illness, and uncertainty. They stepped in mud that hid sickness, touched places where accidents occurred, and crossed thresholds where spirits lingered. Shoes were tiny, everyday reminders that the world outside was unpredictable and often cruel. Bringing that symbolism into the safe zones of the home, onto the table, onto the bed, onto the sacred boundary of the threshold, felt like inviting chaos indoors. So footwear wasn't casual, it wasn't neutral, it wasn't even just practical. It was an object fate watched closely, always ready to punish improper placement. In the past, you didn't fear shoes themselves. You feared what they suggested. A misplaced shoe didn't ruin your day, it threatened your entire life. In the past, doorways were not architectural features. They were not convenient openings, not places you forget to sweep, and certainly not spots where people lurk to eavesdrop. Doorways were supernatural tightropes, thin, fragile boundaries between the safety of your home and the unpredictable chaos of everything outside. Standing in a doorway wasn't casual. It was like standing on the border of two kingdoms during a diplomatic crisis. One wrong move, and something from the other side might decide to follow you in. The idea that thresholds were spiritually charged came from their role in everyday life. A doorway marked the exact point where the known met the unknown, where warmth met cold, where protection met vulnerability. In a world where spirits, curses, blessings, and luck were believed to roam freely, everyone took boundaries seriously, and the doorway was the biggest boundary of all. People feared it, respected it, blessed it, guarded it, and avoided lingering near it like it was a trapdoor waiting to open. One of the strongest beliefs was that doorways were spirit bottlenecks, places where wandering forces got stuck, confused, or curious. Because thresholds were neither inside nor outside, spirits didn't know whose domain it was, and that confusion made the doorway a hotspot of supernatural traffic. If you stood there too long, you risked becoming part of the problem. Spirits were believed to follow sound, warmth, or movement, and if you happened to be blocking the threshold, you might accidentally guide them inside. A polite step in or out wasn't about manners, it was about preventing spiritual hitchhikers. Doorways were so spiritually sensitive that major life events were staged around them. For instance, when brides crossed the threshold of their new home, they were often carried, not out of romance, but to prevent evil spirits from tripping them or slipping inside with them. Weddings weren't just about love, they were about making sure the first person into the marital home wasn't a ghost. Newborns also required strategic threshold handling. Babies were often shown the doorway or passed across it to ensure they were properly introduced to the home's protective spirits. But they were never left sitting near it, because if even adults were considered vulnerable there, a baby had no chance. A parent letting a child crawl across a threshold unsupervised risked community judgment of the highest order. Do you want spirits taking that baby? Because this is how spirits take that baby. Thresholds also played a role in luck rituals. Many households placed charms, herbs, iron objects, carved symbols, above or beneath the doorway to protect the interior. The threshold was a frontline defense system. If protection charms cracked, fell, or shifted slightly, people took it as a sign that something had tried to enter. A crooked horseshoe above the door was not a decorating issue. It was a supernatural breach alert. Visitors were expected to behave carefully. Some cultures believed guests should never greet hosts while standing in the doorway. You either stepped fully inside or stayed fully outside. Lingering symbolized hesitation, and hesitation symbolized weakness, something spirits could exploit. Others believed that blessings or greetings exchanged in the doorway might dissolve or tangle, because the threshold disrupted the flow of spiritual energy. Even arguments were forbidden in doorways. Fighting there risked inviting disaster into the home. If people began arguing near a threshold, someone would physically drag them away from it, not to de-escalate, but to avoid cosmic consequences. Threshold superstitions extended into everyday chores. Sweeping dirt out the front door? Terrible idea. You might sweep good luck out with it. Sweeping dirt into the house? Worse. Bad luck hitchhiking in on dust. People developed precise sweeping techniques to avoid crossing the threshold with anything symbolic. A misjudged broom stroke wasn't cleaning, it was accidental spiritual eviction. And beware the nighttime doorway. After dark, thresholds were thought to be even more active, as spirits roamed freely. People shut their doors tightly, sealed cracks, and avoided standing near them. If someone knocked at night, people hesitated to answer immediately, not because they feared burglars, but because they feared anything that knocked without having hands. Some communities even had strict rules about not calling someone's name through a doorway after sunset. It was believed spirits could steal the name before it reached the intended person. Funerals also revolved around doorways. When a body was carried out of a home, it had to be done feet first so the spirit wouldn't look back and want to return. Some households placed a broom, a knife, or a bowl of water at the threshold to prevent the returning spirit from crossing. Doorways weren't just passageways, they were battlegrounds between the living and the dead. And then there were the omens. If a bird flew into your doorway, misfortune was coming. If a cat refused to cross it, something outside was wrong. If a stranger paused too long before entering, it meant they brought trouble, or were already marked by it. People read doorways the way we read headlines. nervously, expectantly, and with a sense that danger might be hiding in the fine print. At its core, all of this reflected a deep, relatable truth. People needed a sense of control. They needed to believe their homes were safe, and if safety depended on respecting the invisible politics of doorways, so be it. Better to follow the rules than risk misfortune walking straight into the living room. So no, standing in a doorway wasn't harmless, it wasn't neutral, it wasn't a quirky habit or a conversational stance. It was reckless, a gamble with forces no one wanted to provoke. Because in the past, the threshold didn't just separate inside from outside. It separated safety from whatever was waiting on the other side. Before the age of calculators, spreadsheets, and my bank balance did what, numbers had a far more dramatic role in daily life. They weren't just tools, they were omens, threats, warnings, and occasionally ticking spiritual landmines. People didn't fear math itself, they feared what numbers symbolized. Because in the past, counting wasn't neutral. Counting could kill you. Numbers carried personalities. Some were benevolent, some mischievous, and some downright murderous, and people treated them accordingly. If a particular number had a reputation for misfortune, entire communities would bend their lives, habits, and architecture around avoiding it. Take the notorious number 13. Today it's an inconvenience. You skip it on the elevators or laugh nervously on Friday the 13th. But historically 13 was considered the numerical embodiment of something terrible is about to happen. Why? Several reasons, but none comforting. 13 people at a table was believed to guarantee death before the year's end. 13 steps up a staircase could predict household tragedy. 13 items in a bundle, financial ruin. People genuinely rearranged dinner invitations, redesigned buildings, and restructured rituals just to prevent the unlucky number from appearing. Entire streets were built without a house numbered 13. Some towns renumbered homes, so the sequence jumped from 12 to 14, a mathematical lie everyone agreed to because supernatural etiquette mattered more than accuracy. Architects avoided creating 13th floors long before modern elevators made it trendy. In older buildings, you can still find this skip, a silent architectural superstition fossil. But 13 wasn't the only threat. Many cultures feared odd numbers for disrupting balance. Even numbers symbolized harmony, stability, and cooperative spiritual forces. Odd numbers, meanwhile, were awkward troublemakers, numerical pranksters with a reputation for causing chaos. Some regions refused to light odd numbers of candles, serve odd numbers of food portions, or host dances with odd numbers of participants, even meant safe. Odd meant unpredictable. Counting wasn't math, it was risk assessment. In parts of East Asia, the number 4 became synonymous with death because its pronunciation mirrored the word for death itself. This linguistic coincidence turned the number into a social catastrophe. Hospital rooms skipped the number. Hotels jumped straight from 3 to 5. Apartment buildings avoided entire floors. If you lived on the 4th floor, you weren't unlucky. You were brave. And if your address contained multiple 4s, you might spend your life explaining to nervous visitors that you were not, in fact, cursed. Meanwhile, 7, usually considered lucky today, had darker undertones historically. In some places, it was believed the 7th child in a family would possess supernatural powers, healing, cursing, or communicating with spirits. Families didn't fear the number itself, they feared what it created. And heaven forbid you insulted the 7th child. Who knew whether their sneeze or side-eye might doom your crops? Numbers also influenced timing rituals. Certain days of the month were avoided for travel, weddings, or business deals because they carried fatal numerical combinations. People postponed major events to dodge unlucky days. If a numerical omen landed on your birthday, you might quietly accept that the year was already doomed. Even daily chores had numerical rules. Stir something a certain number of times, fold something in a certain sequence, or walk a fixed number of steps to avoid attracting misfortune. Numbers dictated everything from housework to marriage prospects. For farmers, numbers were survival tools. Planting on the wrong numbered day meant crop failure. Harvesting on the wrong number meant storms or pests, so they consulted lunar calendars filled with numeric warnings. It wasn't agriculture, it was numerology with dirt. Travelling also demanded numerical caution. Taking the wrong number of people on a journey was considered dangerous. Too few meant spiritual vulnerability. Too many meant attracting unwanted attention from malevolent forces who disliked crowds. If someone fell sick before a planned trip and the group's number changed to an unlucky count, the trip was postponed. No one risked travelling with a numerically cursed caravan. Even houses weren't safe. The number of beams, windows and rooms held symbolic power. Build a home with the wrong number of structural elements, and spirits might feel invited to move in rent-free. Some regions avoided staircase totals that ended in certain digits, fearing anyone climbing them risked prematurely meeting their ancestors. A homeowner might discover that the most dangerous argument in their life wasn't with a neighbour, but with the carpenter. For the last time, we cannot have 11 steps. Are you trying to ruin me? Birth and death rituals were equally numeric. Some traditions believed souls lingered for a fixed number of days before departing. Families counted these days meticulously, not out of curiosity, but out of fear that miscounting would trap the soul or anger the dead. In other places, naming a baby too early, or after a numerically unlucky day, risked attracting misfortune to the child. Numbers weren't background details. They dictated existence from cradle to grave. People didn't fear numbers because they loved drama. They feared them because pattern recognition was their only tool against a world full of unpredictable hardship. When crops failed, storms hit, or illness struck, numbers offered explanations, some comfort, some warnings, all meaningful. If numbers created patterns, then patterns meant control, and if control meant survival, you didn't ignore the numbers. So yes, counting was dangerous. Math wasn't a neutral activity, it flirted with fate. One wrong number in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the universe might decide you'd simply miscounted your way into disaster. In the past, grooming wasn't a self-care routine. It wasn't relaxing, it wasn't indulgent, and it certainly wasn't the kind of thing you did absent-mindedly over a sink while thinking about lunch. Grooming was a high-stakes operation. Every snip, every clipping, every fallen strand of hair was a tiny, portable piece of you that could be used for good, evil, or the medieval equivalent of identity theft. You weren't tidying yourself, you were shedding magical evidence. And if the wrong person found it, congratulations, you just donated material for your own curse. Hair and nails carried enormous symbolic weight. People believed they held part of your essence, your vitality, your luck, your spiritual blueprint. These weren't dead leftovers. They were active ingredients. Throwing away hair or nail clippings wasn't disposing of trash. It was casually releasing little fragments of your soul into the world, hoping no one with bad intentions picked them up. It's the kind of mistake that could haunt you, in some cases literally. Witchcraft fears amplified this anxiety. Hair and nail clippings were considered prime materials for spells, especially curses or binding magic, which aimed to weaken, control, or torment a victim. If a witch gained access to your hair, they could supposedly cause illness, nightmares, or emotional distress. If they obtained your nail clippings, they could weaken the body or tamper with your willpower. And if they managed to collect both, well, let's just say nobody slept peacefully after that discovery. Because of this, people took extraordinary care during grooming sessions. They clipped nails over specific bowls, burned the remains immediately, or buried them deep where no one could dig them up. Some households collected hair in sealed containers until enough had accumulated to justify a ritual disposal, preferably burning, because fire was believed to break spiritual connections. Imagine having a little jar labelled "Emergency My Hair," and suddenly grooming doesn't feel quite so casual. Even barbers and bathhouse workers were considered suspicious by some. They handled enormous amounts of personal remnants every day, meaning they held more spiritual ammunition than anyone else in town. Some communities trusted barbers deeply, believing they understood protective rituals. Others viewed them with the side eye of someone thinking, if anyone could ruin my life with a handful of hair, it's this guy. Barbers often had to publicly reassure customers that clippings were properly disposed of, otherwise business suffered. Reputation mattered, not just for skill, but for spiritual hygiene. There were rules for when to cut hair and nails as well. Doing it on the wrong day of the week, or the wrong phase of the moon, risked weakening your luck or attracting spirits. Cutting hair after sunset was especially dangerous. Night was when boundaries were thin, and spirits could latch onto the remnants more easily. People genuinely feared that a nighttime trim would function like a cosmic, open invitation to misfortune. If someone absolutely had to cut hair or nails after dark, they recited protective sayings, turned away from mirrors, or faced certain directions to reduce risk. Grooming was a ritual, not a convenience. Travellers were especially cautious. If someone trimmed hair while far from home, they often carried the clippings with them until they could dispose of them safely. Leaving pieces of yourself in unfamiliar territory was seen as reckless. Spirits or witches aligned with foreign lands might use them maliciously. A person scattering their own hair while travelling wasn't just messy. They were practically distributing cursed coupons. Hair that fell naturally, say, onto clothing, bedding, or the floor, was a constant source of low-level panic. People combed through fabrics to collect every strand they could find. Parents checked children's pillows for loose hairs and disposed of them cautiously. If a stranger's hair turned up in your home, that was even worse. It could be interpreted as a deliberate magical intrusion, someone planting material to curse you. You didn't save unexpected hair for an analysis. You burned it instantly and possibly prayed while doing it. Nail clippings had their own law. Throwing them into open water could protect you, but only if done correctly. Burying them could strengthen the body, but only if buried facing the right direction. Leaving them where animals might eat them was catastrophic. Some believed that if an animal swallowed your nail clippings, you would inherit the creature's ailments or behaviour. Losing control of your keratin was, in short, one of the easiest ways to ruin your entire month. Hair carried unique omens tied to health and destiny. A sudden loss of hair could be a warning of spiritual attack. Finding a tangled clump in your comb meant someone envied or opposed you. If your hair fell into food, which absolutely happened in eras before hair ties, you weren't just embarrassed. You worried it meant someone around you harboured ill intentions. Kitchens, already full of omens, became crime scenes whenever a single strand appeared in a pot. Even infants were protected obsessively. Parents kept every hair from a child's first trim, storing or burying it safely. Baby hair was considered especially potent. It held fresh life, meaning it could produce the strongest curses if misused. Losing track of infant hair was a disaster equivalent to losing track of actual treasure. Underlying all these fears was a simple idea. Your body wasn't fully contained within your body. Pieces that fell away still belonged to you, spiritually and symbolically. And if someone controlled a piece of you, they could, in a way, control you. Hair and nail superstitions revealed how vulnerable people felt, constantly threatened by invisible forces, constantly aware of how easily the boundaries of the self could be breached. So grooming didn't make you safer. It didn't refresh you. It didn't reset your spirit. It exposed you, left tiny versions of you scattered wherever you went, each one a potential hazard. And in a world full of witches, spirits, and suspicious neighbours, your biggest enemy might not have been a curse cast at you, but a single strand of hair you forgot to sweep up. In the past, animals weren't just living creatures. They weren't friends, they weren't decorations, and they definitely weren't emotional support companions. They were walking, flying, mooing weather reports for your destiny. Every feather, paw, hoof, and whisker had something to say about your future, and none of them bothered to translate. People watched animals the way we watch stock markets, nervously, constantly, and with the creeping suspicion that something was about to go horribly wrong. Take cats, for example. Modern cats stare at you like they're judging your life choices. Historical cats had the same expression, but people interpreted it as prophecy. A cat washing behind its ears was enough to panic an entire household. Storm coming, stranger arriving, misfortune brewing? Yes, all of the above. Cats were considered natural barometers of fate and no one questioned their authority. If a cat sat facing the door, people assumed someone important, or someone disastrous, was about to enter. If a cat hissed at empty air, you didn't assume it was being dramatic. You assumed something invisible was standing there, and you immediately avoided that spot forever. Black cats in particular terrified or protected people depending on the region. Some believed crossing paths with a black cat guaranteed misfortune, while others believed black cats absorbed bad luck like furry sponges. But no matter the interpretation, one truth was universal. A cat's behaviour mattered. It wasn't cute. It was informational. If your cat suddenly bolted under the table, you prepared for guests, storms, thieves, spirits, all of them at once. Living with a cat was like living with a cryptic oracle that knocked things off shelves as punctuation. Birds, meanwhile, were nature's loudest omens. People believed birds moved between worlds, earth, sky, and whatever realm their eerie staring connected them to. A bird tapping on a window was practically a telegram from the afterlife. If a bird flew into a house, the message was even clearer. Death was coming or had already arrived somewhere nearby. People didn't chase the bird out. They negotiated with it like it was a spiritual UPS driver with a delivery they really didn't want. Owls were especially feared. Their nighttime calls were believed to foretell tragedy, illness, or witchcraft activity. An owl hooting near your window wasn't ambiance, it was a warning with feathers. Killing an owl was considered dangerous, but letting it hang around was worse, so people often resorted to elaborate rituals to politely convince the owl to take its foreboding business elsewhere. Then there was the rooster, an animal that was practically a walking alarm system for good and bad luck. A rooster crowing at the wrong time, say in the evening, was a catastrophic omen. People thought it meant betrayal or unexpected death. If a rooster crowed 3 times at night, you didn't sleep. Not because you were afraid of noise, but because you were afraid of fate. In some regions, a rooster crowing on your wedding day predicted arguments, infertility, or in-laws who overstayed their welcome, in other words, disaster. Dogs, often loyal companions today, were once considered supernatural sentinels. A dog whining at night signalled approaching misfortune. A dog howling toward the sky meant death was near. If a dog suddenly stopped at a threshold and refused to cross, people assumed it sensed a spirit blocking the way. You didn't tug the dog forward, you backed away and reconsidered your entire life path. Dogs were trusted more than humans when it came to sensing the otherworldly. If a dog barked at empty space, it wasn't nothing. It was something that you definitely did not want to see. But the most revealing omens came from livestock. These animals were tied directly to survival, so their behaviours were interpreted like urgent spiritual memos. A cow refusing to enter its stall meant a bad winter was coming. A horse stamping on a particular day could predict storms or illness. Sheep bleating strangely meant quarrels in the household. People observed their animals with the intensity of someone watching a very slow, very confusing suspense film. And every movement, silence, or sneeze carried weight. Farmers in particular believed livestock reacted to spirits. If a horse suddenly reared while being harnessed, it wasn't stubbornness, it was an invisible presence. If chickens fussed and flapped for no reason, spirits were crossing the yard. A hen crowing like a rooster, which sometimes happens, was considered so dangerous that people often removed the hen entirely from the barn. Not because the hen upset them, but because it upset fate. Even insects carried omens. A single bee entering your house could mean good fortune, but killing that same bee reversed the luck instantly. Butterflies represented the souls of the departed. Moths circling a candle foretold guests. A swarm of insects. That was just a nightmare, but people still tried to interpret it symbolically before running. Underlying all of this superstition was a simple truth. Animals reacted to things humans couldn't see, hear, or understand. Whether natural or imagined, Those reactions unnerved people. And when you live in a world without meteorology, germ theory, or noise-cancelling headphones, you start relying on anything that seems to know more than you. Animals became messengers, tiny prophets who communicated warnings using only their bodies and terrible timing. So pets weren't companions, they weren't cute, they weren't loyal sidekicks. They were portents, moody, unpredictable, and absolutely convinced they were doing you a favour by screaming at shadows. And the people of the past listened, because in a world ruled by mystery, sometimes the best advice really did come from something covered in fur and looking mildly annoyed at you. In the past, sleeping wasn't a peaceful nightly reset. It wasn't restorative, it wasn't cosy, it wasn't even optional rest. Sleeping was a tactical maneuver you performed while hoping, truly hoping, that nothing took advantage of you while you were unconscious. Because the moment you fell asleep, your soul, your body, your home, and your fate all became vulnerable. People treated sleep like a dangerous neighbourhood. You didn't go in unprepared, and you definitely didn't go in facing the wrong direction. Direction, in fact, was everything. Many cultures believed the orientation of your body while sleeping determined whether you'd wake up at all. Sleeping with your head pointed north? A terrible idea in parts of Europe. North was spiritually associated with the land of the dead, the direction of cold winds, the realm of ancestors, not exactly the bedtime energy you wanted. If someone insisted on sleeping northward, people whispered about shortened lifespans or fading health. You weren't resting, you were disrespecting geography. Facing west was equally ominous since the sun set in the west. And what else sets? Life, vitality, good fortune. People sleeping westward were symbolically turning themselves toward endings. If the wind outside also happened to be blowing west that night, well, you'd practically written a resume for the afterlife. South and east, however, were considered safer directions. The east was tied to sunrise, renewal, rebirth. Facing east meant aligning with life's beginnings. South was associated with warmth or protective deities, but even these weren't perfect. A door facing east? Fine. A window facing south? Good luck. But mix these things up and people worried your bedroom was an energetic blender sending mixed messages to wandering forces. Then there was the matter of sleeping positions. Certain postures were believed to encourage healthy dreams or keep the soul anchored. Others, they risked letting the soul roam too far. Sleeping on your back, for example, was dangerous in many traditions. It left your chest exposed, symbolically inviting spirits to sit on you, press on you, or slip inside. This fear eventually evolved into folklore explaining sleep paralysis. If you woke up unable to move, it wasn't a neurological glitch. Something supernatural was sitting on your chest, evaluating your life choices. Sleeping on your stomach was no safer. That position was believed to suffocate dreams or trap the soul by pinning it too close to the earth. Many believed that sleeping face down made it easier for malevolent forces to whisper into the sleeper's ear, because even spirits, apparently, appreciated good acoustics. The safest position was curled or side sleeping, which protected the heart, stabilized the soul, and made you resemble a cautious woodland creature trying not to be eaten. But the bed itself also mattered. Placement, height, materials, everything had meaning. A bed too close to the floor left you vulnerable to spirits crawling beneath it. People believed malevolent forces liked to lurk under beds like supernatural dust bunnies waiting for their moment. A raised bed was safer but too high, and the soul might struggle to re-enter the body upon waking. Balance was crucial. Bed placement was like interior design directed by ghosts. Beds couldn't face mirrors either. If you fell asleep facing a reflective surface, people believed your soul might get confused trying to return, or worse, wander into the mirror world and get trapped. Waking up soulless was considered a possibility, and honestly mirrors back then were unsettling enough that no one argued. Nighttime vulnerability extended to sounds and movements as well. If you talked in your sleep, someone might interpret it as your soul negotiating with spirits. If you walked in your sleep, you weren't sleepwalking, you were following a spirit or being lured by the dead. Families sometimes tied sleepers lightly to prevent nighttime wandering, not because they feared falling down stairs, but because they feared a possessed midnight adventure. Even the objects near your bed mattered. Keeping shoes or hair remnants near the bed was seen as dangerous, for reasons explored in earlier chapters, but never repeated. Sharp objects were banned. Spirits were believed to follow points or edges like trails. Water by the bedside was protective in some places, but an invitation in others. Some families kept iron near the bed. Others placed a knife under the mattress to ward off nightmares, though everyone agreed the knife must never point toward the sleeper, or it risked cutting the soul. Nothing said sweet dreams like sleeping over a hidden blade with careful orientation rules. Doors had to be shut, windows too, not for safety from humans or animals, but to keep spirits from drifting in while you slept. Drafts were suspicious. Flickering candles were suspicious. Even the moonlight was suspicious to some, and if moonbeams touched a sleeping person's face, it was believed they could wake moonstruck, disoriented, cursed, or slightly less sane. People pulled curtains tight, not for privacy, but to prevent celestial mischief. Dreams, of course, were their own minefield. A bad dream might predict illness. A good dream might be a trick. A dream of falling might be the soul slipping back into the body incorrectly. People feared waking suddenly, because it might snap the soul's connection like a rope pulled too fast. Waking someone abruptly was frowned upon, not because it was rude, but because it might accidentally kill them. What all these superstitions reveal is that sleep wasn't passive, it was dangerous. Night was a battlefield, and your body lay unguarded for hours. People crafted layers of rules, rituals, and orientations to feel safer, even though none could guarantee a peaceful night. Because in the past, rest wasn't recovery. It was strategy, a nightly attempt to survive the dark without inviting anything to follow you into the light. Sleeping wrong didn't just mean discomfort, it meant tempting fate, and fate, everyone believed, slept lightly. In the past, dreams were not private. They were not meaningless. They were not something you woke up from, shrugged at and blamed on strange cheese. Dreams were statements, and legally admissible ones, depending on when and where you lived. Your subconscious wasn't just bubbling out nonsense while you slept. It was giving testimony, naming suspects, predicting disasters, and occasionally, quite inconveniently, getting you into trouble. People believed dreams came from beyond the self, that they were messages delivered to the mind during the quiet hours. Some said gods created them, others said ancestors whispered them. Still others insisted dreams were the preferred communication method of spirits who couldn't be bothered to speak during waking hours. No matter the source, dreams were not personal, they were public business. You didn't own your dreams, society did. For many cultures, dreams served as prophecies. The dreamer became a reluctant messenger, burdened with information about harvests, illnesses, marriages, wars, and natural disasters. A dream of water overflowing could signal flooding. A dream of animals fleeing could predict famine. A dream of fire might warn of disease or conflict. People didn't say, "It was just a dream." They said, "The spirits have spoken," and adjusted their schedules accordingly. If you dreamed of a broken object, someone in your family might rush to fix everything in the house before breakfast, just in case. These prophetic dreams were so common that dream interpreters became respected professionals. They studied symbols, omens, and patterns the way modern analysts study data. To them, a dream wasn't a psychological puzzle. It was a code, one that, if cracked correctly, could prevent tragedy or uncover hidden truths. Dream interpreters held more social power than some local officials, because when your insights could predict death or success, people listened. But dreams didn't just predict events, they also served as warnings. Many believed dreams came from protective forces trying to alert the sleeper to danger. If someone dreamed of falling, it meant misfortune approached. If they dreamed of teeth falling out, it meant a death was coming. Dreaming of losing clothing signaled humiliation or social disaster. Dreaming of shadows meant someone nearby was plotting against you. After a dream like this, people changed plans, avoided travel, or stopped trusting certain neighbours. A nightmare wasn't a bad experience, it was actionable intelligence. Dreams also acted as confessions, often involuntarily. Suppose someone in the community fell ill, crops failed, or an item went missing. If a dream implicated a person, even indirectly, that dream could become part of the investigation. Yes, you could be accused of wrongdoing because someone else dreamed it. Imagine being dragged into a community meeting because your neighbour dreamed you stole their chicken. And no, you couldn't just say, "I didn't do it." You'd have to counter with your own dream or a symbolic ritual to prove innocence. People trusted dreams more than human alibis. In some medieval courts, dream testimony was considered circumstantial evidence. A judge wouldn't convict solely on a dream, but a dream could influence suspicion, prompt inquiry, or justify interrogation. This made dreams both powerful and dangerous. Your unconscious mind might reveal secrets you hadn't intended to share, or invent crimes you hadn't actually committed. If you dreamt of harming someone, people might wonder why your spirit took such liberties during sleep. Dreams weren't fiction. They were thought to reveal the true self. The fear of dream confessions grew so strong in some areas that people avoided speaking their dreams aloud unless absolutely necessary. A dream once voiced gained power. It circulated. It gathered interpretations. It could change reputations. Whispering a dream to the wrong person was like accidentally posting a scandalous rumour on the village bulletin board. Silence was protection. Talking was risk. Conversely, kings and rulers relied on dreams as policy guidance. Many royal advisors were essentially dream consultants, deciphering visions to determine whether to go to war, sign treaties, or execute rivals. A monarch could wake up, declare that a dream foretold danger, and rewrite the political landscape before breakfast. The fate of kingdoms sometimes hinged on a potent combination of sleep deprivation and symbolism. Dreams were also tied to guilt. If someone committed a moral offence, their dreams were expected to reflect it. People suffering from nightmares were often asked, "Whom have you wronged?" Dreams of being chased, attacked, or exposed could be interpreted as the soul attempting to confess. This made sleep extremely stressful. You couldn't even process anxiety privately. Your subconscious tattled. To counter nightmares or prevent dangerous dream symbols, people practiced nighttime rituals. They placed protective objects under pillows, avoided sleeping near certain items, or ate specific foods believed to generate helpful dreams. Some wore amulets meant to block spiritual messages entirely, because sometimes ignorance really was bliss. These objects didn't guarantee pleasant dreams, but they reduced the chance of waking up and accidentally predicting someone's death. Interpretation varied widely by culture, but one idea remained consistent. Dreams bridged worlds. They blurred the lines between the living and the dead, between the conscious and the unconscious, between safety and danger. A dream wasn't an escape. It was a meeting place. Anyone, spirit, ancestor, deity, or malicious force, could visit. This made dreams both valuable and terrifying. People wanted the messages, but not the risks. Beneath all the superstition lay a rational truth. Dreams reflected fears, hopes, and stresses people carried. Their lives were uncertain. Illness, loss, famine, and conflict shaped daily existence. Dreams offered meaning, perhaps not accurate but comforting. They turned chaos into symbols and symbols into guidance. Dreams became the community's way of navigating the unknowable. And so your subconscious wasn't resting, it wasn't relaxing, it wasn't wandering freely. It was testifying, holding court inside your skull, presenting evidence you never agreed to provide. In the past, a dream could change your day. A dream could change your reputation. A dream could change your fate. Sleep was risky. Dreams were the transcripts. In the past, rain was never just weather. It wasn't, "Oh good, the crops will be happy," or "Great, now the laundry won't dry." Rain was a message, a moody, dramatic, and often aggressive expression from forces far larger and far touchier than humans. Nowadays, meteorologists warn us about cold fronts and atmospheric pressure. Historically, people warned one another about who must have angered the gods this time. Storms were not random events, they were reactions. If thunder rumbled overhead, people assumed someone, perhaps even someone nearby, had offended a deity, violated a taboo, or merely existed in a way the heavens found unsatisfactory. Lightning wasn't electricity, it was a divine side-eye hurled from above. Rain wasn't precipitation, it was a cosmic tantrum. Communities lived with the constant awareness that they were being watched by powerful beings whose emotional stability was, generously speaking, questionable. If the sky darkened suddenly, people didn't say weather's changing, they said Mdias, who did something foolish? And immediately everyone mentally reviewed the last 24 hours for offences. Did someone cut wood on a forbidden day? Insult a shrine? Walk through a sacred grove without greeting it? Forget to thank the sun? You didn't just fear the storm, you feared becoming its reason. In many regions, rainstorms were seen as punishment for collective behaviour. If a village suffered a string of heavy rains, elders assumed the community had failed morally or spiritually. People sought scapegoats. The unlucky might be accused of angering spirits through improper rituals, careless words, or a cursed aura. Being storm-marked was a real social fear. If lightning struck a house, it wasn't viewed as a physics problem, it was a character judgment. But storms weren't only punishments, they were also warnings. A sudden rainfall at the wrong moment, during a wedding, a funeral, or a festival, signalled that unseen forces were displeased. A drizzle at dawn could mean a journey should be postponed. A downpour at midday could warn of incoming illness. The sky was basically a giant complaint department, and weather was its preferred method of delivering strongly worded memos. Thunder was especially intimidating, treated like spoken anger from the heavens. A single thunderclap during an argument or negotiation was interpreted as divine commentary. If negotiations broke down during a storm, people didn't blame the tension. They blamed the sky for refusing to bless the outcome. Thunder had veto power. Lightning, meanwhile, was feared as the ultimate spiritual verdict. A bolt striking a field meant the crops were cursed. Striking a tree meant spirits were cleansing the land. Striking a person meant they had been personally targeted, whether for purity or punishment depended on the storyteller. Some legends said lightning chose the unclean, others said it purified the worthy. Either way, surviving a lightning strike made you suspicious, either chosen or cursed, but definitely not ordinary. Rainbows, however, were mixed signals. Some saw them as signs of forgiveness, divine peace, or good fortune. Others believed rainbows marked boundaries where spirits travelled. Walking toward a rainbow's end was considered reckless. It might lead you straight into another realm, which sounds whimsical until you realise other realm usually meant place you don't return from. Farmers had their own weather superstitions. Rain at the wrong time could threaten survival, so they interpreted every pattern carefully. Rain on certain feast days foretold poor harvests. Rain falling while the sun was shining indicated mischief from trickster spirits. If rainbows appeared too frequently, it meant the sky was unsettled, a heavenly mood swing none of them appreciated. Some communities believed rain responded not to behaviour but emotion. If too many people in a village were grieving, sorrow accumulated in the sky until it wept. Rain was the atmosphere having empathy, or a breakdown depending on the severity. Other groups thought rain signalled conflict among gods. Storms were not weather events, they were domestic disputes between celestial beings, with mortals caught in the splash zone. Rain rituals were an essential part of life. To stop rain, people performed dances, burned offerings, or rang bells to scare away storm spirits. To summon rain during drought, they performed the same rituals but with different chants, because apparently the universe appreciated subtle differences in choreography. Rainmaking ceremonies involved drumming, dancing, singing, and a significant amount of nervous glancing at the sky, hoping it would respond favourably rather than angrily. Even personal rain curses existed. If rain began immediately after someone stepped outdoors, it was seen as evidence that fate, spirits, or deities found that particular person inconvenient. People avoided travelling with the rain magnet for fear of sharing the cosmic punishment. Likewise, if someone consistently avoided rain, always arriving home seconds before a storm, they were viewed as spiritually blessed, a person the sky liked too much to dampen. Homes were built with rain symbolism in mind. Roof angles, gutter placement, and even thatching patterns were chosen to please weather spirits. A leak wasn't just structural failure, it was a divine reprimand for poor hospitality or lazy ritual offerings. Repairing roofs involved charms or prayers to ensure the sky approved of the adjustments. Every raindrop tapping on a window was interpreted as commentary. Ultimately, weather superstitions came from a world where people had little control over nature. Rain could save or destroy. It could nourish crops or rot them. It could water animals or flood entire regions. And when something has that much power over your survival, you assign meaning to it. You watch it. You fear it. You negotiate with it. So when rain fell in the past, people didn't reach for umbrellas. They reached for explanations. The forecast didn't predict rain. It predicted blame, and everyone hoped it wasn't aimed at them. In the past, speaking wasn't a simple act of communication. It wasn't self-expression, it wasn't harmless chatter, and it definitely wasn't something you did casually before thinking. Talking was a hazardous activity. One wrong word, one misplaced name, one innocent mutter at the wrong hour, and you might summon misfortune like a medieval customer service representative who didn't realise they had dialed the supernatural hotline. Words held weight, power, and occasionally explosive consequences. If you wanted to survive, you had to treat your vocabulary like volatile chemicals. The idea that words could alter a reality was widespread. People believed spoken language existed in the same category as spells, not metaphorically, but literally. To say something aloud was to release it, to give it wings, to place it into the ears of fate. A thought could be private, but a word belonged to the world, and once released, it could not be controlled. One of the most feared spoken taboos was naming dangerous forces. Whether spirits, demons, or malevolent beings, saying their names aloud acted like an unwanted invitation. People believed these entities lurked in the edges of the world, waiting for someone foolish enough to call them. Even ordinary conversation could accidentally poke the supernatural. Entire cultures developed euphemisms, vague, polite nicknames to avoid saying something's true name. The good folk instead of fairies, the gentle ones instead of ghosts, the other man instead of the devil. Not because anyone thought these beings were actually gentle, but because insulting them by using their actual names was considered suicidal. Even speaking about misfortune risked inviting it. Saying someone looked ill could make them ill. Voicing worry about death could attract death. Mentioning a bad harvest might jinx the crops. Words were thought to be predictive, as if the universe took them as requests. People responded with frantic phrases meant to cancel the effect. Knocking wood, spitting over their shoulders, touching iron, or quickly changing the subject into something cheerful, like goats. Goats were surprisingly neutral in most contexts. A whole category of spoken taboos revolved around cursed phrases, combinations of words believed to bring disaster. Some were tied to specific times, such as speaking certain words at night, which risked attracting wandering spirits. Others were forbidden in certain places. A wrong word in a forest, near a well, or by a crossroads could misalign your fate for weeks. And heaven help you if you spoke carelessly near a graveyard. The dead were believed to be excellent listeners. There were also ritual silences, sacred pauses meant to protect or honour moments. Breaking these silences wasn't rude, it was dangerous. Silence during storms, silence during births, silence during death watches, silence during harvest rituals, even silence during bread making in some places, to ensure the dough rose correctly and didn't absorb negative intentions. Talking could spoil everything, from the energy of a ritual to the literal food on the table. Names especially carried miraculous and terrifying power. To know someone's name meant having influence over them. To speak it aloud meant shaping their destiny. Parents sometimes delayed naming their infants for weeks to avoid drawing spiritual attention to them too soon. If someone had suffered repeated illnesses or misfortune, they might be renamed to confuse the spirits stalking them. Conversely, speaking the name of a deceased loved one too frequently risked pulling their spirit back from its resting place. Worse still, saying the name of someone who was actively ill or cursed could worsen their condition. Words weren't just vibrations, they were connections. Naming someone tied your voice to their fate like a thread, for better or worse. In some cultures, people use secret names known only to close family, keeping their public names deliberately bland to avoid spiritual interference. Talking wasn't just communication, it was exposure. Spoken taboos extended to accidental prophecies. If someone uttered a phrase that resembled a prediction, like, "This won't end well," or "watch someone fall," people braced themselves. Headskits were considered binding. Once said, the event became more likely. A careless remark about misfortune could ripple through the community for days. People learned to speak in cautious, optimistic tones, not because they felt positive, but because pessimism was dangerous. Then there were the death curses, not intentional curses, but ordinary phrases that became lethal if spoken aloud at the wrong time. For example, saying you wished someone would leave the village could be interpreted as inviting harm to them. Expressing frustration or wishing misfortune on someone, even jokingly, risked activating spiritual forces eager to fulfill any request that sounded even slightly negative. Humour had to be handled gently, or else the punchline became a funeral. And let's not forget omens delivered through overheard words. If you walked past someone speaking and caught a phrase like "bad luck," "cold wind," or "prepare yourself," it didn't matter whether they were discussing weather or gossip. The words were considered directed at you. People avoided eavesdropping not because it was rude, but because it could ruin their day. Words also shaped architecture and law. Some households forbade certain topics from being spoken near thresholds. Some communities banned uttering specific words near livestock, believing animals absorbed human speech in dangerous ways. In extreme cases, local laws punished people for saying cursed words during important events. Being too loud, too honest, or too clumsy with language could destabilize social order. Why so much fear? Because life was fragile. Crop failure, illness, storms, and accidents shaped everyday existence. Words offered explanation. If speaking something could cause it, then not speaking it became a form of control. People clung to this verbal discipline as a shield against randomness. So talking wasn't free, it was never casual, it was a gamble with fate, a negotiation with unseen forces. One careless word and you didn't just ruin a conversation. You risked summoning consequences that no apology could undo. In the past, childhood was not a carefree era of expiration naps and running around while adults smiled fondly. Childhood was a high-risk category. Children were considered spiritually porous, soft targets for any wandering curse, spirit, omen, illness, or cosmic inconvenience drifting through the neighbourhood. A child's soul was thought to be new, unanchored, and not yet stubborn enough to stay put. Adults weren't parenting, they were performing full-time supernatural security detail. The idea was simple and terrifying. Evil forces loved children, loved to watch them, follow them, bother them, and, if given the chance, snatch them. Babies as specialists were considered irresistible to malevolent beings because newborns were believed to hover halfway between worlds. Their souls were fresh arrivals, not yet hardened, like handwritten invitations for trouble. A baby sneezing, yawning, staring into empty corners, or crying for no reason wasn't dismissed as normal child behaviour. It was interpreted as the baby interacting with something unseen, and nobody wanted to think too hard about what that something might be. To defend children, families turned to charms, small objects carried or tied to the infant to ward off harm. These charms could be beads, stones, iron tokens, carved symbols, bones, or herbs tied in cloth. Babies looked less like children and more like portable charm necklaces. No one questioned it. Protection came before fashion. Iron was especially powerful, believed to repel dangerous forces. Some parents placed tiny iron objects in the baby's cradle. Others sewed iron fragments into clothing or blankets. A child wrapped in iron wasn't stylish, they were warded. Red threads were another common protection. In many regions, a strip of red cloth tied around the wrist or ankle protected children from the evil eye, a force believed to strike out of jealousy or admiration. If someone complimented a child too strongly, parents worried the praise itself was harmful. Compliments were risky business. Admiration was seen as spiritually radioactive. Adults responded with counterphrases like, "May misfortune fall away," or "Let the child not be noticed." A strange but effective way of saying, "Thanks, please don't doom my kid." Cradles were spiritual battlegrounds. Parents placed objects underneath them to prevent spirits from creeping upward. They lined them with blessed herbs or hung protective symbols overhead. Knives placed under cradles, hidden of course, were meant to repel supernatural intruders, not because the infant was expected to duel demons, but because iron repelled spirits and steel drew symbolic boundaries. A baby's cradle was less a sleeping space and more a spiritual fortification. The fear of nighttime danger was intense. After dark, children were thought to be especially vulnerable. Souls wandered, spirits roamed, and dreams created openings. To protect babies, parents kept small lamps or candles burning. Light discouraged the unseen. Some families burned incense or herbs near the cradle to keep misfortune at bay. Others avoided letting the child sleep near windows, where wandering forces might gaze in. If the baby cried suddenly at night, adults rushed to soothe them, not because of noise, but because crying could attract attention from things better left unmentioned. Names also played a role. As mentioned earlier in a different context, but now in a fully new way, children's names were considered armour. Some families delayed naming the baby for weeks, fearing that giving the child a name too soon would alert spirits. Others gave ugly or unappealing temporary names so that evil forces would overlook the child, believing them unworthy of attention. This is how perfectly healthy infants ended up with nicknames like Soot, Mud, or Little Beetle. It wasn't affection, it was stealth mode. Even bathing was guided by superstition. A child's first bath had to happen at the right time with the right water, gathered from the right source. Some families added salt, herbs, or symbolic items to the bath to cleanse the child spiritually as well as physically. Water spilled on the ground after bathing had to be discarded carefully, because leftover bath water was believed to hold pieces of the child's essence. Mishandling it invited illness. Visitors were another hazard. If someone visited too soon after a child was born, parents grew anxious. The visitor might carry bad luck, ill will, or spiritual residue from their own home. Touching a baby without permission was taboo. People weren't avoiding germs, they were avoiding hexes. In some cultures, guests were required to touch iron before holding a baby, effectively disarming themselves of spiritual threats. Even laughter wasn't safe. A baby laughing at nothing in particular, especially at night, terrified adults. Laughter was believed to indicate that the child was interacting with an invisible entity. Some thought it was an angel. Others thought it was something decidedly not angelic. Either way, nobody wanted to test the theory. Parents whispered prayers, waved charms, or moved the cradle to a different location, just in case the baby was correct in sensing company. Mobility created new problems. Once a child began crawling or walking, parents watched carefully for patterns. Crawling toward a door could signify danger drifting in. Crawling toward a fireplace could symbolize an ill omen. Crawling in circle? Spirits watching. Crawling directly toward a certain family member. Symbolic favoritism guided by unseen forces. Children weren't just children. They were unpredictable magnets for meaning. Sickness in children was often attributed to spiritual causes. A sudden fever could signal the evil eye, requiring ritual remedies, smoke cleansing, or gentle chanting. A child refusing to eat might be suffering from a curse. Teething was practically treated as a supernatural trial. Parents responded with protective measures, even if they had no idea what they were protecting the child from. Underneath all these rituals, charms, and precautions lay a crushing reality. Childhood mortality was high. Illness struck quickly, accidents were common. The world was dangerous, and superstition filled the space where medical understanding could not yet reach. People weren't irrational, they were desperate. They wanted to believe they could shield their children from unpredictable tragedy. So childhood wasn't innocent. It wasn't carefree. It wasn't just simple. It was heavily guarded, protected by threads, charms, whispered blessings, iron tokens, vigilant parents, and a constant awareness that the world was watching. Because to the people of the past, raising a child wasn't just parenting, it was spiritual defense work. In the past, pregnancy was not a glowing celebration, nor a gentle journey involving soft music and prenatal vitamins. It was a superstitious emergency, a months-long crisis in which everyone involved behaved like the household was under siege. Pregnant women were considered open doors, vulnerable to spirits, curses, wandering misfortune, jealous neighbours, and any cosmic force that happened to be bored. Meanwhile, birth itself was treated as a battlefield where the mother and child fought for survival against both the physical risks and the supernatural threats everyone believed hovered nearby. Pregnancy began with secrecy. Many cultures refused to acknowledge a pregnancy aloud for months because naming it too early was thought to draw the attention of malevolent forces. Even congratulating a pregnant woman could be viewed as dangerous praise, tempting the universe to balance the scales. Instead of cheerful announcements, communities leaned into euphemisms like, "she's being careful," or "she's visited by fortune," all vague enough to avoid cosmic scrutiny. Clothing was its own source of fear. Pregnant women were warned never to tie knots, lace tightly, or wear anything binding around the stomach, not for physical reasons, but because knots symbolically trapped energy. The idea was simple. A knot around the mother meant a knot around the child's fate. Babies could become tangled in the womb, trapped by curses, or hindered by symbolic bindings. Even tying your shoelaces on the wrong day could allegedly tighten the invisible grip fate had on the unborn child. Food choices were equally nerve-wracking. Certain foods were believed to shape the baby's personality or future luck. Eating round fruits might bless the child with good health. Eating misshapen vegetables risked giving the child an unlucky disposition. Craving sweets meant a gentle baby. Craving spices meant a fiery one. And whatever you did, don't spill salt near a pregnant woman. Everyone already knew that was a death omen waiting to happen. Households became culinary minefields where every bite symbolized destiny. Expectant mothers were also cautioned against certain places. Wells, crossroads, and forests were believed to be hotspots for spirits who might influence or steal unborn children. Crossing a flowing stream was considered risky. Water was thought to carry away a spiritual essence. Funeral processions were avoided entirely. Death and birth were too symbolically opposite to mix safely. If a pregnant woman accidentally encountered one, she had to perform an immediate protective gesture, such as touching iron or reciting a charm, to avoid transferring death's shadow to the baby. As the due date approached, the household became a ritual centre. Windows might be kept shut to prevent spirits from slipping inside. Protective herbs, sage, rosemary, juniper, were hung above doors or burned in the corners of rooms. In some regions, charms made of iron, wood, or bone were hidden under the birthing bed to repel invisible intruders. Even the placement of furniture mattered. Chairs couldn't face certain directions, blankets couldn't be folded a particular way, and mirrors were absolutely forbidden near the birthing space. No one wanted the mother's reflection caught in a mirror at such a vulnerable moment. Spirits could use that reflection as a pathway. When labour began, silence became mandatory. Not peaceful silence, strategic silence. Birth was a liminal moment, a crossing between worlds, and noise was believed to attract attention from both good and bad forces. Some midwives whispered birthing instructions, others communicated through gestures. Even loud breathing was sometimes discouraged. If the mother cried out too forcefully, people feared the sound might alert envious spirits who wanted to disrupt the process. Midwives were not just medical figures, they were spiritual specialists. Many were trained in rituals as much as childbirth techniques. They muttered protective prayers, tied charms to the mother's wrist or ankle, sprinkled symbolic water or herbs, or marked the doorway to block supernatural interference. They often kept specific objects, an iron knife, a wooden spoon, a blessed thread, nearby to symbolically cut or redirect harmful forces trying to influence the birth. There was also the terrifying belief that spirits might try to swap the newborn with a changeling, a supernatural imposter. To prevent this, mothers weren't allowed to sleep deeply after giving birth. They needed to stay awake long enough to ensure the baby's essence settled firmly in the world. Visitors were carefully vetted. Some households refused to let anyone outside the immediate family see the infant for days, fearing the evil eye or unintended curses. Even praising the newborn too much was dangerous. Compliments were downplayed with protective phrases, "May your fortune be guarded," or "Let no harm be jealous of you." Newborn care was surrounded by rituals to anchor the child safely. A coin placed under the cradle invited wealth. A red ribbon tied to the wrist warded off envy. Bath water from the first wash had to be disposed of carefully, often poured away from the house so no wandering spirit could touch it. Gifts were chosen for symbolic meaning: silver for purity, wool for warmth, bread for sustenance. No one gifted knives, scissors, or sharp objects, since these might cut the child's future luck. Even naming the baby was a delicate operation. A name was more than identity. It was a shield, a declaration, a spiritual anchor. Naming too soon risked drawing attention. Naming too late risked confusing protective forces. Some cultures gave a temporary secret name known only to parents, used to protect the child from supernatural harm. Others named the child after ancestors to invoke their protection, and some avoided the names of recently deceased family members, fearing the child might inherit unfinished business. In the days following birth, rituals continued. Visitors quietly performed blessings. Mothers observed purification practices. Neighbours delivered symbolic foods meant to strengthen luck as much as the body. Protecting the newborn wasn't a single event, it was an extended campaign. Ultimately, pregnancy and childbirth were terrifying because they sat at the centre of life's most unpredictable forces. With high mortality rates and little medical understanding, superstition became a scaffolding, a way to feel in control of something utterly uncontrollable. Every charm, ritual, whisper and rule was an attempt to shield mother and child from dangers both visible and invisible. Bringing life into the world required silence, luck, courage, and countless rules. Because in the past, birth wasn't just biological, it was spiritual warfare. In the past, when someone died, the event didn't feel final. It didn't feel contained. It didn't feel like a clean transition from one state to another. Death was not a polite visitor who came, completed its business, and left through the nearest exit. No, death lingered. It hovered. It soaked into rooms, objects, bed sheets, furniture, and even the air. People feared not just the moment of death, but the afterglow, the supernatural residue that clung to everything the deceased had touched. Death didn't end, it loitered. The room where someone died became immediately suspect. It wasn't simply a room, it was a border zone where the veil between worlds had thinned. People entered cautiously as though death was still standing in the corner, deciding who to tap next. The air felt heavier, quieter, wrong. Even the light through the windows seemed different, as if it arrived reluctantly. Families often avoided the room for days or even weeks, believing death's presence needed time to disperse. And no one slept there, not unless they wanted the soul of the departed to use them as a temporary chair. Beds were especially dangerous. A bed where someone died wasn't just furniture, it was a spiritual trap. People believed death liked to revisit its favourite places, and a deathbed was like a welcome mat. Some families dismantled the bed frame entirely. Others dragged the bed outside and burned it. The logic was simple. If you destroyed the bed, death couldn't come back for seconds. Keeping it in the house was practically inviting death to take a nap at its leisure. Even washing the sheets wasn't enough. Textiles were porous, and superstition insisted they absorbed the final breath like a sponge. Objects belonging to the deceased also carried dangerous residue. Clothing was carefully handled because fibres were believed to hold fragments of the person's soul. Tools, jewellery and furniture were avoided for a time so as not to disturb lingering energies. Even mirrors were treated with suspicion. People feared the departing soul might have gotten trapped inside. This is why many households covered all mirrors immediately after someone died. Not because they feared reflections, but because they feared seeing something reflected that wasn't among the living. The body itself posed spiritual hazards. People believed death didn't fully leave right away. It lingered near the corpse, watching, adjusting, settling counts. Because of this, the period between death and burial was treated with extreme caution. Candles burned constantly, not for visibility, but to keep spirits at bay. Herbs and fragrant smoke filled the air to create a barrier between the living and whatever might drift toward them. Some families placed coins over the eyes to prevent the dead from seeing anyone worth taking with them. And these weren't symbolic gestures, they were practical defences. Many regions required that the body be taken out of the house feet first. The reasoning, if carried head first, the deceased might look back and decide someone in the household should join them. Death was believed to be persuasive and the living didn't want to tempt curiosity. Even animals understood the tension. Dogs, known for sensing unusual energies, sometimes refused to enter rooms containing the dead. That refusal was taken seriously. If a dog wouldn't cross the threshold, humans followed its lead. Superstition trusted animals more than bravery. The doorway itself became a key player in death rituals. After the body left, people swept the threshold carefully, believing death paused there. This wasn't cleaning, it was eviction. A broomstroke symbolised a final "you may leave now" message to the lingering presence. Some households sprinkled salt or water across the entrance to ensure the dead didn't wander back inside. Doors were sometimes left open for hours after a removal, allowing the soul to exit freely. Closing the door too soon risked trapping the spirit, leading to restless hauntings, or worse, the belief that the deceased might try to reclaim their old place in the home. Many communities believed death contaminated the surrounding air. Visitors avoided houses where someone had died recently, not out of social discomfort but fear of absorbing misfortune. The air itself had to be reset. Burning herbs, reciting prayers, clearing corners, these were essential steps to push death out of the walls. Furniture might be rearranged to disrupt lingering energy patterns. Windows were opened even in winter so death could drift out, which unfortunately meant freezing the living, but superstition always outranked comfort. Even after burial, the deceased wasn't entirely gone. People believed the dead could return, not maliciously, but because death's transition was complicated. A restless spirit might linger if unfinished business remained, if rituals were incomplete, or if objects belonging to the dead weren't properly handled. Families reported footsteps, cold drafts, shifting shadows, or the unsettling sense of being watched. These weren't considered haunting signs, they were normal symptoms of death overstaying its welcome. Some superstitions warned that if the deceased's name was spoken too soon or too often after burial, it might call their spirit back. Silence wasn't out of grief, it was out of caution. Memories were spoken quietly, stories whispered, gratitude expressed inwardly. Mourning had rules, not just traditions. Clothing of the dead was distributed slowly, cautiously. Wearing a shirt too soon after someone's death risked absorbing their misfortune. Giving away belongings too quickly was believed to insult the spirit. But keeping everything indefinitely risked inviting the deceased to linger. It was a delicate balance. Honour, release, distance and caution, all intertwined. Why all this fear? Because death was unpredictable, and the people of the past had far fewer explanations for it. When someone healthy died suddenly, the cause felt supernatural. When sickness spread, households felt cursed. When death struck more than once in a short period, families believed something unseen had taken an interest in them. Superstitions filled the gap where science had not yet entered. They gave structure to chaos, rituals to fear, procedures to grief. And so death didn't leave quietly. It didn't walk away. It didn't close the door gently behind itself. It stayed, hovering in rooms, clinging to objects, waiting at thresholds. Because to people of the past, death wasn't an event. It was an unwelcome guest who needed a great deal of encouragement to leave. In the past, household objects were not passive. They were not background decor. They did not sit quietly waiting for your next use. They watched you. They absorbed your moods, your actions, your secrets, and your sins. People believed that everything from chairs to spoons had spiritual memory, an unsettling trait that made even the most mundane object a potential witness to your life. Your home wasn't a collection of items, it was a collection of opinions. The idea was simple. If you spent enough time around something, slept on it, sat on it, cooked with it, leaned against it, that object absorbed part of you. Your luck, your emotions, your moral residue. The more intimate the connection, the stronger the imprint. If you wept into a pillow often enough, it held sadness. If you plotted revenge while sitting in a certain chair, that chair absorbed tension. If you felt anxious stirring soup with a specific spoon, the superstition went, that spoon was now anxious too. You weren't surrounded by things, you were surrounded by archives. This belief made furniture feel less like comfort and more like accountability. A bed didn't just know you slept there, it remembered how you slept. A table didn't just hold your meal, it recorded the atmosphere of every argument ever held upon its surface. A cradle absorbed the emotional landscape of a home. A cupboard could hold anger just as easily as it held dishes. If a household experienced repeated misfortune, people sometimes blamed the oldest objects, claiming they had accumulated too much grief or witnessed too much wrongdoing to remain spiritually neutral. The most notorious items were chairs. Chairs weren't merely seating, they were thrones of emotion. If someone sat in the same chair every day, the chair was believed to soak up that person's essence. A chair belonging to a chronically ill family member became a sick chair. A chair belonging to someone disgruntled became a grumbling chair. And heaven help you if you sat in a dead person's favourite chair too soon after their passing, you risked absorbing their leftover fate, or worse, inviting them to reclaim the seat in the middle of the night. Beds were even more powerful, not only because of their association with vulnerability, but because beds witnessed everything from birth to illness to death. Beds were considered memory vaults. If misfortune repeatedly struck a family, people sometimes replaced the bed entirely, believing the old one harboured melancholic energy or residual dread that insisted on circulating. Even the wooden frame wasn't safe. Wood was thought to drink emotion through years of contact. A creak in the night wasn't dismissed as aging timber. It was interpreted as the bed commenting. Kitchen tools also held reputations. A knife used during an argument was avoided during future meals. Its edge was thought to sharpen conflict. A pot that boiled over during a tense moment was labelled temperamental. A spoon associated with sorrow because someone cried while stirring with it might be hidden away so it wouldn't influence future cooking. People genuinely worried that emotionally tainted tools could flavour food with misfortune. Mirrors, even though their role was explored earlier, also fell into this larger category of observing objects. They didn't just reflect your face, they reflected your fate. People avoided looking into mirrors after emotional outbursts, because the mirror might record the emotion and transmit it back later. Seeing yourself in a mirror while angry or grief-stricken was said to trap those feelings in the glass, releasing them unpredictably afterward. A mirror was a judge with an impeccable memory. Doors and thresholds, previously examined as spiritual boundaries, also had internal personalities here. A door that stuck shut during a family fight was believed to take sins. A threshold that creaked ominously was expressing supernatural displeasure. People talked to their doors, not charmingly, strategically, but no object had a more unsettling reputation than the heirloom. Passed down through generations, heirlooms weren't prized for beauty or quality. They were prized or feared for the emotional weight they carried. A ring worn by a joyful person brought joy. A shawl worn by someone unlucky carried that misfortune forward. A family Bible could absorb blessings, but a family chest could absorb secrets. If multiple tragedies affected a household, people sometimes traced them back to an inherited object believed to be holding unresolved energy. Removing the object, through burial, burning or gifting it to someone with stronger spiritual boundaries, often a very patient neighbour, became an act of survival. Even musical instruments weren't simply instruments. A fiddle played during a fight became discordant and might interfere with harmonious music thereafter. A drum associated with grief could summon sorrow. Bells rang for celebrations, but if a bell cracked or sounded strangely, people believed it had absorbed too many negative events and was warning of another. Objects were also used intentionally to store fate. People whispered wishes into jugs before sealing them. They hid letters of hope in walls, expecting the house to protect those intentions. They placed coins under floorboards to attract wealth, not metaphorically, but because they believed the house would remember and honour the request. A house wasn't shelter, it was a collaborator. This worldview also meant objects could turn dangerous. If someone committed a crime or a betrayal, objects in the room were believed to become spiritually contaminated. A table where an injustice occurred might infect future meals. A shirt worn during deceit could cause skin ailments. A loom that witnessed conflict might tangle yarn or break threads until appeased. Why so much emphasis on object memory? Because homes preserved the history of their inhabitants. In societies where tragedy was common and explanation scarce, people comforted themselves with the idea that misfortune had causes, however supernatural. If objects remembered emotions, then by managing those objects, cleansing them, rearranging them, retiring them, you could manage fate. This belief gave people a sense of agency. They couldn't control disease, weather, or mortality, but they could control the emotional archives surrounding them. They treated objects with caution because objects in return shaped their lives. So yes, your house wasn't neutral, it wasn't mute, it wasn't passive, it was observant. It absorbed your triumphs, your failings, your arguments, your hopes, and then quietly influenced what came next. Every object held a memory, and every memory held consequences. Travel today is stressful enough with delayed flights, broken GPS signals, and the eternal question of whether you remembered your charger. But in the past, travel wasn't just stressful, it was spiritually hazardous. Leaving home meant leaving the protective bubble of your familiar walls, stepping directly into a world full of signs, warnings, and wandering forces who all apparently had opinions about your trip. A journey wasn't a journey, it was an omen marathon. You didn't pack bags, you packed anxieties. The very moment you planned to travel, fate started watching you. People paid attention to the smallest signs before stepping outside. If you sneezed while preparing to leave, that alone could delay your trip. 1 sneeze meant caution, 2 sneezes meant danger, and 3 sneezes meant you should cancel the trip altogether because the universe had clearly made its feelings known. If a household object fell while you were getting ready, a cup, a broom, a shoe, that wasn't clumsiness, it was a divine, "Are you sure about this?" warning. Then there was the great superstition of the first person you saw when leaving your house. This encounter could shape your entire journey. See someone cheerful, good sign. See someone angry, terrible sign. See someone carrying an empty bucket, cancel all travel plans immediately. An empty bucket symbolized empty fortune. A full bucket was fine. Half full indicated mixed results. Fully empty meant your trip was doomed. The bucket industry unintentionally became one of history's largest omen generators. Even animals played their part. If a dog crossed your path on the way out, that was manageable. If a black cat crossed your path, meanings varied widely, but most agreed it wasn't ideal. Birds were worse. Birds flying from right to left predicted trouble. Birds flying left to right were good luck. A bird circling overhead? A spiritual warning. A bird defecating on you? Surprisingly, a sign of good fortune. Superstition occasionally had a sense of humour. Once you made it out your front door, which itself was an omen hotspot, you had to deal with directional danger. Starting a journey by walking north was sometimes lucky, sometimes unlucky, depending on the region. Starting westward at dawn was considered unwise. The sun was still deciding its mood. Starting eastward at sunset made people uneasy. Moving opposite the sun's path symbolized resisting fate. Some cultures believed that beginning a journey on certain days of the week attracted disaster, while beginning on others attracted prosperity. Tuesday might be perfect for short trips, but catastrophic for long ones. Friday might doom sea voyages, but bless marriage-related travel. It was all very logical if logic was written by cryptic poets. Returning home for a forgotten object created another problem. Doubling back was considered spiritually dangerous. If you had to go back indoors, some cultures required you to sit down briefly before leaving again, to reset the journey's omen. Others said you needed to look into a mirror, touch iron, or turn around 3 times to avoid returning with bad luck stuck to your heels. Forgetting your hat and going back indoors wasn't forgetfulness. It was fate testing your preparedness. During travel, omens followed relentlessly. Roads were not neutral pathways. They were channels of spiritual energy. Crossroads in particular were considered hotspots of supernatural activity. People avoided lingering there, knowing crossroads were liminal spaces where spirits negotiated their own mysterious business. Travellers often left offerings, coins, bread, herbs, to ensure safe crossing. Ignoring a crossroads was like barging into a meeting you weren't invited to. Weather also served as commentary. Rain at the start of a trip might signal a cleansing of obstacles or an immediate warning to turn back. Thunder during travel was rarely good. Wind blowing strongly against your direction meant fate itself disapproved of your destination. And if the sky suddenly darkened without warning, travellers interpreted this as a sign that spirits or ancestors were trying to reach them. Travel wasn't just physical, it was a negotiation. Unexpected sounds along the road also carried meaning. A sudden crack of a branch could signify danger ahead. An echo that returned oddly suggested the presence of spirits. Footsteps behind you when no one was there meant someone or something was following. Travellers learned to walk briskly in those moments, as though speed could outrun metaphysical interference. If you passed a funeral procession along the way, superstition required immediate action. Some travellers touched their hats, others stepped aside and bowed, and others whispered blessings or protective phrases. A funeral crossing your path meant the boundary between life and death was thinner than usual. Ignoring it risked inviting sorrow into your own journey. Arriving safely at your destination did not end the omen marathon. You needed to enter the new space correctly. Enter through the wrong door? Bad luck. Enter without greeting the household spirits, whoever they were? Bad luck. Enter with your left foot instead of your right? Bad luck. And woe to anyone who knocked incorrectly, because yes, even knocking had ritual significance. Too soft, and spirits might think you were sneaking in. Too loud, and you might offend the household spirits. There was no winning, only careful participation. People relied on travel omens not because they were fearful, but because travel was genuinely dangerous. Roads lacked protection. Weather was unpredictable. Illness struck without warning. Bandits existed. Horses fell, boats overturned. Superstition filled the void where infrastructure and medical knowledge lacked. Omens provided structure, a sense that the universe offered hints, warnings, nudges. Travel wasn't adventurous, it wasn't liberating, it wasn't glamorous, it was suspicious. every step observed by signs, symbols, and unseen forces that travellers believed were eager to guide or sabotage them. Before maps, before compasses, before weather reports, people navigated the world with intuition, fear, rituals, and luck. Because to the people of the past, a journey wasn't measured in miles, it was measured in omens survived. In the past, money was not neutral. It wasn't a simple medium of exchange, it wasn't an economic tool, and it definitely wasn't the comforting jingle in your pocket signalling you could finally afford bread today. Money was spiritually radioactive. Every coin carried moral weight. Every transaction had cosmic consequences. Wealth wasn't earned, it was negotiated with unseen forces. And most importantly, wealth didn't grow. It offended fate. Coins especially were thought to carry the residue of every hand they touched. If a prosperous man handled a coin, people believed the coin absorbed a little of his luck. If a miser touched one, it absorbed bitterness. And heaven help you if a coin came from someone suffering misfortune. That was considered a cursed transaction. Coins from the unlucky transferred their burdens to the next holder, quietly, efficiently, like supernatural accounting software. Many people refused change from someone in mourning. They wouldn't accept payment from someone sick. They avoided taking coins late at night, when spirits were believed to hover near thresholds and influence exchanges. Accepting money after sunset was considered risky because darkness obscured not just financial clarity, but moral clarity. Who knew what invisible force hitchhiked on a nighttime payment? Even finding money was a suspicious event. Today, picking up a stray coin feels like winning a micro-lottery. Historically, it felt like touching a spiritual trap. A coin found in the road might belong to wandering spirits. A coin left on a windowsill could be bait from a witch. Picking up a coin from a crossroads? Terrible idea. Crossroads were the supernatural equivalent of danger, high voltage. Only if the coin gleamed unmistakably in sunlight did people trust that it came from the living rather than the dead. Money given as a gift required protective ritual. A purse given empty signaled bad luck for both giver and receiver. To avoid this disaster, people added a token coin, even a tiny one, to seed the gift with prosperity. An empty purse meant an empty destiny. A coin inside meant symbolically that fortune had already entered. People took this so seriously that failing to include a coin was considered almost rude, as if you were handing someone misfortune wrapped in leather. But gifting money wasn't always positive. A gift could be interpreted as magical influence. In some regions, people feared accepting coins from strangers, especially if the coins were warm. A warm coin suggested enchantment, or worse, intent. People avoided taking payments directly into their palms. Instead, they placed hands beneath cloth or into bowls to prevent spiritual transfer. Money wasn't dirty. Money was dangerous. Loans especially carried moral weight. Lending someone money meant lending them part of your spiritual fortune. If they repaid late, or not at all, your luck became entangled with theirs. People believed unpaid debts dragged down the lender's fate. Worse yet, forgiving a debt outright could anger certain spirits who oversaw balance and fairness. Generosity was suspicious. Charity was risky. Helping someone financially might accidentally rewrite your cosmic standing. Likewise, borrowing money required caution. Borrow at the wrong time of day and you borrowed misfortune along with it. Borrow on the wrong day of the week and you might never repay the debt because fate had already sabotaged the agreement. Borrow from someone who resented you and you risked absorbing their envy. Borrow from someone too prosperous and their luck overshadowed yours, making repayment spiritually impossible. People viewed borrowing as opening a portal, not a wallet. Curses involving money were alarmingly common. Witches, according to folklore, could enchant coins to drain luck from recipients. Cursed coin might sit innocently in a pouch while quietly unravelling the owner's fortune, spoiling milk, souring business deals, breaking tools, encouraging petty arguments, and ensuring the chickens refused to lay eggs. If a household suddenly experienced a streak of small but relentless misfortunes, the first suspect wasn't bad luck. It was a coin that didn't belong. To counteract such threats, people performed purification rituals on their coinage. Passing money through smoke, dipping it in salt water, or laying it beneath the light of the full moon were popular methods. Some even believed jingling coins dispelled malevolent energy, turning your everyday pocket noise into a protective chorus. Still others carried lucky coins, worn smooth by decades of rubbing, convinced that the coin held enough positive energy to outweigh all others. Markets were spiritual battlegrounds. Transactions had to be completed cleanly, with both parties satisfied. If someone haggled too aggressively, they risked spiritually poisoning the exchange. If a seller accepted less than the item's symbolic worth, they believed they gave away more than merchandise. They gave away a portion of their prosperity. To avoid this imbalance, many merchants kept protective charms underneath scales, tables, and coin boxes. The first sale of the day was the most crucial. If it went poorly, if the buyer haggled ruthlessly or walked away, or paid with suspicious-looking change, the entire day's luck was spoiled. Merchants sometimes accepted extremely low offers early in the morning simply to complete that first sale. Better to start with a symbolic success than risk a spiritual failure. One sale could set the tone for the next 12 hours. Even how money was stored mattered. Coins kept in disorder risked breeding chaos in household finances. Coins kept near sharp objects risked cutting wealth. Coins kept near the bed risked inviting poverty into dreams. People tied up money in cloth bundles or placed it inside wooden boxes carved with protective symbols. Some buried coins under thresholds to attract prosperity. Others feared that burying money trapped the soul of wealth underground. You never knew whether you were nurturing good fortune or accidentally imprisoning it. Underlying all of this financial anxiety was a harsh truth. Survival was precarious. Wealth determined security, yet economic life could be upended by drought, illness, political shifts, or happenstance. In a world where money equaled survival, people needed explanations for sudden fortune or ruin. They needed rules. They needed rituals. Superstition offered a sense of structure, meaning where there was none, so wealth didn't grow. Wealth didn't flow. Wealth didn't simply appear as a result of labour. It offended fate. Unless you managed every coin, every exchange, every gift, every debt with the ceremonial care of someone handling spiritual explosives. Because in the past, money wasn't currency. Money was destiny, with opinions, grudges, and an alarming ability to ruin your week. Today, festivals are excuses to celebrate, music, food, and the annual reminder that humans will gather anywhere as long as there are snacks. But in the past, festivals weren't primarily about joy, they were about survival. Every celebration, no matter how loud, colourful or chaotic, was at its core a strategic manoeuvre against the unseen. Festivals were defensive rituals disguised as entertainment. The masks weren't decorative, the noise wasn't enthusiasm, the dancing wasn't freedom, it was all tactical. To understand historical festivals, imagine living in a world where evil wasn't a metaphor. People believed malevolent spirits roamed freely, especially during seasonal transitions when the veil between realms thinned. The changing of the year, the turning of the seasons, the solstice points, harvest endings, these were vulnerable times when fate, spirits, ancestors, and cosmic forces all adjusted their positions. Humans, caught in the middle, responded with the most ancient strategy known to man: throw a party so loud the spirits get confused. Noise wasn't celebration, it was weaponry. Bells, drums, rattles, pots, pans, shouting, chanting, clapping. Every sound was selected not for rhythm but for intimidation. The goal was to scare off anything lurking nearby, to convince malevolent forces that the area was too lively, too chaotic, or too spiritually fortified to bother with. People believed evil preferred quiet, so they made sure quiet never happened. Mask wearing, a staple of many festivals across cultures, wasn't a costume contest. It was spiritual camouflage. Masks allowed humans to confuse spirits who might otherwise target them. If evil was looking for a particular face, someone vulnerable, unlucky, or recently marked by misfortune, A mask disrupted the hunt. In some festivals, people wore terrifying masks to scare off malevolent forces. In others, they wore animal masks to align themselves with protective spirits. Either way, the mask's purpose was simple. Don't let the supernatural know who you are today. Costumes added another layer of confusion. Dressing as spirits, animals, ancestors, or monsters allowed participants to blend into the supernatural crowd. If spirits wandered among humans during festivals, as many believed, then looking like something non-human gave you a fighting chance. Worse yet, if a spirit tried to grab you, you'd hope it grabbed the wrong masked participant and wandered off, baffled. Fire played a starring role in many celebrations, not because humans are instinctively drawn to flame, though they are, but because fire symbolized purity, protection, and visibility. Bonfires blazed high to ward off wandering souls. Torches lit processions meant to guide ancestors safely or frighten harmful beings away. Jumping over fires, an ancient ritual in many cultures, wasn't proving bravery. It was cleansing oneself from accumulated spiritual grime. Sparks weren't pretty. They were shields. Parades and processions, with their loud footsteps, rhythmic noise, and collective movement, weren't simply crowd spectacles. They were coordinated efforts to sweep evil from streets and crossroads. Roads and thresholds, as explored earlier, were hotspots of supernatural traffic. A parade, loud, chaotic, unstoppable, was believed to flush bad spirits out like a spiritual street cleaning service. The bigger the parade, the more thorough the cleansing. Food, too, had ritual significance. Feasts weren't just feasts, they were bribes. People offered symbolic portions to spirits, ancestors, or gods to appease them and secure good harvests, health, or fortune. Leaving food out overnight wasn't forgetfulness, it was diplomacy. Eating specific foods during festivals aligned the participant with desired traits. Round breads for renewal, sweet fruits for prosperity, bitter herbs for protection. You weren't snacking, you were negotiating your future through carbohydrates. Certain festivals embraced chaos intentionally. Rules were inverted, roles reversed, mischief encouraged. This wasn't social rebellion, it was spiritual misdirection. By creating deliberate disorder, people believed they could confuse malevolent forces who relied on predictable patterns. If a spirit expected a household to be quiet, orderly, and fearful, one night of roaring, laughing chaos disrupted their plans. Disorder became a temporary shield. Mischief was survival strategy. Even dancing served hidden purposes. Dance circles symbolized protection, unity, and continuity. Fast, erratic dances mimicked the movements of protective spirits. Slow, ritual dances honored ancestors and asked them to guard the living. Some dances were believed to trap evil, forcing it into a spiral pattern it couldn't escape from. You weren't dancing to celebrate, you were dancing to block, redirect, or confuse supernatural threats. Timing mattered. Festivals were strategically placed at hinge points in the year: the darkest night, the coldest transition, the first harvest, the first thaw. These moments were believed to be spiritually unstable. Celebrating wasn't optional, it was a necessary reinforcement of the world's fragile balance. If humans didn't participate, unseen forces might claim more influence than they should. Festivals were preventative maintenance for reality. Participants themselves underwent temporary transformation. Wearing masks, dancing wildly, or participating in ritual games allowed people to symbolically reset their luck. Someone who had suffered misfortune in the previous season could step into the new season spiritually cleansed. Chaos was catharsis, laughter was purification. The festival gave people permission to release emotional, spiritual, and psychological burdens they'd carried all year. But festivals also came with rules. Strict rules that had to be followed or risk cosmic backlash. Masks couldn't be removed at certain times. Fires had to be kept burning until dawn. Offerings had to be placed precisely. No celebration was casual. Every act, no matter how festive it appeared, was loaded with meaning. Underneath the noise and colour was a deep anxiety. The world was unpredictable and often cruel. People needed rituals to assert control. Festivals provided that control, not by ignoring danger, but by confronting it with noise, laughter, masks, fire, and community. Parties weren't fun, they were tactical, they were survival masquerading as celebration. Because in the past, humans didn't just celebrate life, they defended it loudly, joyfully, and with as many bells as possible. To modern ears, the superstitions of the past sound excessive. Doorways watched carefully, coins treated like moral conspirators, childbirth conducted as though the walls themselves might intervene. But to the people who lived with these beliefs, none of it was strange, none of it felt irrational. Superstition wasn't a burden or a curiosity, it was emotional armor, a system that turned a chaotic, punishing world into something legible. Fear didn't weaken people, it organized them. Life in earlier centuries was fragile, danger wasn't occasional, it was ambient. Illness struck without warning. Weather ruined food supplies, travel could end a life. Animals attacked, fires spread. Misfortune arrived like clockwork, and no institution, medical, political, or religious, could reliably protect anyone from it. So people built invisible frameworks to navigate visible threats. If they couldn't predict nature, they could at least interpret signs. If they couldn't prevent tragedy, they could prepare for it emotionally by believing the universe warned them first. Superstition offered that structure. It turned randomness into patterns, accidents into messages, vulnerabilities into strategies. A world without clear cause and effect became a world where everything meant something, and that meaning created a layer of psychological insulation. Take omens, for instance. Seeing a bird on the wrong side of the road didn't actually influence the outcome of a trip, but believing it meant danger allowed travellers to prepare mentally, and preparing mentally made danger feel more manageable. It transformed fear from a shapeless threat into a specific one. If the universe whispered be cautious, then at least the universe was paying attention. Even bad signs were comforting because they implied someone, or something, was communicating. Rituals did even more heavy lifting. Ritual wasn't mere repetition, it was a promise. A promise that if you performed an action correctly, chaos might give you a pass today. Knocking on wood, tying red strings, carrying iron, greeting doorways, burning herbs, these weren't quirks. They were negotiations with fate. Each ritual offered a sense of agency in a world where people had very little. Superstition also filled the explanatory void. When disease arrived without pattern, people searched for hidden connections. When a healthy child fell ill overnight, attributing it to the evil eye or a misstep in ritual was less terrifying than admitting life was random. Randomness was emotionally unbearable. Superstition gave tragedy a shape, sometimes cruel, sometimes comforting, always clearer than uncertainty. Communities relied on shared beliefs as social glue. A family might disagree on politics or marriage alliances, but everyone agreed you shouldn't sweep the house at night or speak certain words during a storm. These collective rules created unity. Families had roles, someone to interpret dreams, someone to monitor weather signs, someone to bless objects. The household became a collaborative defensive system. Fear, instead of isolating people, linked them together. And superstition wasn't purely negative. It created hope. If misfortune could be caused by invisible forces, it could also be repaired by them. Healing rituals, charms, and protective ceremonies gave people emotional relief. When a mother tied a charm to her child's wrist, she wasn't giving in to fear, she was fighting it. Hope wrapped in twine. Protection disguised as folklore. Belief systems also softened grief. Death felt less final if the soul was believed to linger, visit, or watch over the living. Dreams of the deceased weren't tormenting, they were messages. Objects touched by the dead weren't remnants, they were connections. Superstition let people maintain relationships beyond the grave. The world felt less lonely. For many, superstition served as moral structure. Wealth gained unfairly was believed to sour. Kindness brought blessings. Cruelty attracted spirits. A world with no laws of cosmic justice suddenly had them. Not written laws, but vault laws. Invisible, but deeply observed. People behaved narrowly, cautiously, respectfully. Not because they feared social judgment, but because the universe itself was watching. Superstitions could even provide personal empowerment. Knowing the right gesture, the right phrase, the right ritual gave individuals a sense of mastery. A powerless farmer could feel protected, a mother could feel capable, a traveller could feel guided. Everyday people, those with little wealth or influence, held entire systems of cosmic negotiation at their disposal. Superstition democratized spiritual survival. These belief systems also helped people navigate emotional volatility. Anxiety became omen awareness, grief became ritual, fear became preparation, hope became charmcraft. People externalized internal turmoil, giving their feelings form and ritualistic solutions. When your inner world is mirrored by an outer system, life feels less overwhelming. And crucially, superstition created meaning. A world without meaning is unbearable, but a world where spilled salt is a warning, a whistling wind is a message, a festival is protection, and a dream is testimony, that world feels alive, connected, purposeful. You were never alone in your struggles. The universe was an active character. Superstition wasn't foolishness. It was strategy. It was resilience disguised as ritual. It was psychological infrastructure in an era before therapy, science, or social safety nets. It helped people endure cold winters, long nights, crop failures, plagues, and brutal losses by offering a framework that said, there is order, there are rules, you can learn them. Fear didn't weaken people, it organized them into communities, into rituals, into patterns of survival. And in a world where life could collapse in an instant, emotional armor was not optional. It was literally everything. After traveling through centuries of pilled salt, dangerous thresholds, accusatory mirrors, cursed coins, emotional furniture, predatory spirits, tactical festivals, and dreams that functioned like subpoenas, it's easy to wonder, how did anyone function? How did people survive while believing every sneeze, shadow, bird, object, neighbour, and household sound carried the potential to reshape their fate? Yet the real marvel is not that people lived with so many superstitions. The marvel is that superstition kept them going. In a world with no stability, no guarantees, and far more threats than comforts, these beliefs formed a survival toolkit far more practical than it might appear to modern eyes. Superstition wasn't chaos. It was structure. It wasn't panic. It was planning. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern-making in a world where real danger was relentless. The good news, you made it through the day. The bad news, you almost certainly broke rules you didn't know existed. To modern minds, the world feels governed by cause and effect, science, and probability. But imagine living without that framework, without reliable medicine, without meteorology, without food security, without political stability. Imagine a world where a single storm could destroy your livelihood, where disease could wipe out half a village in a week, where childbirth was as risky as battle, where darkness offered no safety, and where misfortune arrived without explanation. In such a world, you wouldn't crave rationality first. You wouldn't crave convenience. You would crave meaning, something that told you why things happened, and more importantly, how to avoid them. Superstitions provided exactly that. They transformed daily life into a series of navigable rituals. They gave rules to the unpredictable, language to the unknowable, and agency to the powerless. Every rule, no matter how bizarre, was a coping mechanism based on lived experience. If walking a certain direction on certain days coincided with misfortune enough times, the pattern became a belief. If a family avoided tragedy for years while keeping a specific charm above the doorway, that charm became sacred. If generations passed down warnings about mirrors or shadows or crossroads, they did so because someone, somewhere experienced something frightening enough to remember. Superstition wasn't random. It was memory, cultural memory stretched across centuries encoded in symbols. Just as importantly, superstition protected people emotionally. Fear didn't paralyze them, it organized them. Instead of drowning in uncertainty, they created rituals, small, consistent actions that made the world feel manageable. These rituals built community, shared gestures, shared caution, shared hope. If a neighbour's rooster crowed at an odd hour, it became everyone's concern. If a child cried at night, the whole household soothed not just the child, but the threat they believed hovered at the edge of darkness. If a festival erupted in chaotic joy, it wasn't simply celebration. It was a collective shield raised against whatever winter or spirits were on their way. Superstition wasn't isolation, it was cooperation. It also provided emotional cushioning for grief, anxiety, guilt, and uncertainty. If something terrible happened, there was at least a symbolic reason, an omen missed, a ritual forgotten, a charm that slipped, a rule overlooked. Pain without meaning is unbearable. Pain with context becomes survivable. Even the most frightening belief served practical ends. Fear of cursed objects encouraged people to cleanse and repair their environments. Fear of restless spirits ensured respectful treatment of the dead. Fear of omens encouraged caution during travel or harvest seasons. Fear of broken rules reminded people that their lives were interconnected, that actions carried symbolic consequences, that carelessness had weight. Superstition filled the gap between human vulnerability and the harshness of nature. It wasn't childish, it was adaptive. And while science eventually replaced many of these beliefs, the psychological functions remain. Modern people may not fear doorways or spilled salt, but they still knock on wood, avoid certain days, wear lucky clothing, cross their fingers, whisper secret hopes, or feel uneasy when a black cat darts across their path. The rituals changed. The emotional need didn't. Superstition evolved because humans evolved, but the core desire stayed rooted. We want the world to make sense. We want to believe we can influence fate, even a little. We want signs, patterns, warnings, reassurances, clues. We want to feel protected, even when life proves otherwise. So the good news, you made it through the day. You avoided spirits, dodged omens, survived dreams, handled money ethically, as far as you know, bypassed cursed furniture, and crossed thresholds without accidentally insulting the universe. Well done. The bad news, you almost certainly broke rules you didn't know existed. You stepped with the wrong foot first. You ignored a sign. You left something in the wrong position, said something too loudly, or thought something at the wrong hour. By the standards of the past, you've probably doomed yourself at least 7 times since breakfast, but that was always the point. Superstition wasn't about perfect behaviour. It was about trying in a world that gave no guarantees. It was about caring enough to pay attention, to find meaning, to protect what mattered. And in that way, nothing has changed. Because even today, when life becomes uncertain, overwhelming, or painfully unpredictable, people still reach for rituals. They still seek emotional armour. They still want to believe that making sense of the world might just help them survive it.